kind of a feeling that I got a long time ago listening to Kenneth and then having read this book. And I don't think they were even for the same classes or anything like that. I don't think I read this in relation to Kenneth. I read it in some other class or something. It's just to give you an idea of how it just seemed to me it's kind of like the way he's trying to tie everything together. It's very interesting. And I mean, last week is interesting. I don't know what y'all think about that. I don't talk when I'm around Kenneth because I have nothing to say to him. You know, he, either what I say is false and he doesn't need to hear it, or it's true and he's already thought of it years ago. I had little or nothing to the conversation, but you listen as he, like last week, he just he says a sentence and that introduces a new theme that leads him in a new direction, and then that goes, and he can go like that for days. I think, I've been with seminars where he's talked in that same mode for 4 or 5 days, getting everything together, and you're sitting there frantically. Oh, we're over here in the German idealist. Oh, now we're dealing with the pre-Socratic Greeks. Now we're doing it. Well, this is Rick's thing. Take over, Rick. I'm going to mute myself out of kindness to the group.
I was wondering, Rick, did you get anywhere with Aphorism 9 from Beyond Good and Evil?
Not yet. Not yet. It's been a busy week. I've captured it in the notes, but I haven't gone any further than that with it.
Where he puts the boot into the Stoics.
He certainly does. He certainly does.
And now we're going to discuss that thing which is dear to us all, the ego. Just remember, ego is not a dirty word, as the Skyhawks sing.
Yes. Yes. Well, we've got some new folks this week, so I want to do a quick intro. For those of you new to this seminar, this is the 102nd week that we've been doing the current arc of the seminar. The seminar is older than that. It's been going on for 3.5 years, I guess. And this seminar is about the philosophy of Kenneth Smith, Texas philosopher. And the current arc, that we're on week 102 of, is going through a book that he wrote from 1998 to 2000, and that David and I are working on getting published at last. Because he originally wrote it as a series of installments in a column in the back of a magazine about comic books, of all things. But it's not about comic books. This is straight philosophy. This is existentialist philosophy. And what he's talking about here is the exercise of trying to learn how to get free of the modern worldview as a trap, so that the modern worldview can be adopted optionally rather than something that we're stuck in and can't get out of. And to do that, it's called Millennia and Microcosm, because he's talking about 3 epochs in history: the ancient epoch, the medieval epoch, and the modern epoch. And he's starting with the ancient. Chapter 4, which we've been on for quite a while, is about the ancient epoch. And that's, typified by classical Greece, although there's plenty of others who subscribe to the same worldview. And then when we finish chapter 4 and move on to chapter 5, we'll begin work on the medieval epoch. And then the final chapters in the book will bring us to the modern. And so the idea of this exercise is that what we're striving to do, we're reading his text and we're analyzing his text, we're making our own connections. It takes this long because we're sort of free-form in our discussion about it. We make our connections to it, like Donald was talking about with the glass bead game. We sort of each bring our own experiences to it, and what does it remind us of or make us think about, so that we can really wrestle with these things. And the goal in each of these cases is not to create a cartoon version of the worldview of past epochs, And that's very difficult because it's normal for somebody which is all of us, who grows up within a single epoch's worldview, to change everything we look at to make it fit our preconceptions, so that we're never seeing the thing as it actually is. We're only seeing our interpretation of it. And the challenge for this book is to learn some significant differences between the ancient worldview and the modern worldview. These will be very uncomfortable things, things that we will not want to, or not easily be able to come to terms with, which is, again, why it's time consuming to do. But if we do each of these things, and there's a lettered section A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and now we're in H, for each of these kind of core ideas of the ancient epoch, if we really come to terms with it and wrestle with it, we start to realize the ways in which the modern worldview, which prides itself on seeing everything clearly in a scientific, modern, advanced way, is actually a worldview like any other worldview with plenty of blind spots, and distortions. And in some cases, even really erroneous, problematic ideas that we all take for granted, but we don't realize what a problem they are. So those kind of joining us now are a little bit of a disadvantage because we've been doing this for a while. But we'll take our time, and anytime you have questions, just bring them up and we'll talk about them. What we're working on now is the section H, sophism and corruption. And we're in the second paragraph of this. And this is talking about the idea of how it was that the ancient worldview began to collapse. And we see this collapse clearly during the Peloponnesian War, which Thucydides wrote that great history of. We see it in Rome. By the time we get to Rome, which comes later, the ancient worldview is incredibly corrupt. That's the late stage of the ancient epoch, in which corruption has taken over. The power seems, unassailable. The Roman Empire is the most powerful thing anybody's ever seen. Strides the world. It seems like the ancient epoch will never end. But instead of being a blessing, as they thought at the beginning of the ancient epoch, it's now becoming a curse, as the Roman historian Tacitus wrote about the Pax Romana, which the Romans bragged about, that they were bringing peace to the world. He said they make a desolation and call it peace. In his attempt to describe the corruption. There's a Hegelian idea here about zeitgeist, the idea that an epoch of history is not just a collection of years that happen to fall together on a timeline, but rather it's an organism. It has its own process of birth and emergence and development, rising to its full powers, which is followed by a period of decay and decline until it eventually collapses and has to be replaced because nobody can stand it anymore. And this is how the ancient epoch under Rome came to an end and was replaced by the rise of the medieval epoch. And similarly, it's how the medieval epoch came to an end and led to the rise of the modern epoch, which began in revolt against the medievals, just like the medievals began in revolt against the ancients. So, sophism and corruption. He's talking here that everything that's kind of core to the ancient worldview was covered in sections A through G. And now we're talking about how it fell apart, how it decayed. And he's anatomizing this because the processes of decay of the ancient worldview have become central to what we consider to be the virtues of the modern world. The things that we extol are freedom, are being systematic and organized about things, a nation of laws, not men, a scientific, objective worldview, people getting together into groups and making decisions about their future, rather than submitting themselves to the authority of nature or the authority of God, which were the peak ones for the ancient and medieval worldviews respectively. These are things that we think of as the core virtues. We recite parts of the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence or the UN charters to try to bolster ourselves and say, yes, these are the things we're proud of. Those very things we're proud of are the things that the Greeks were ashamed of during the period of the Peloponnesian War, because they saw the spread of those ideas as tearing apart their society. And they weren't entirely wrong. These worldviews are incompatible with each other. You can't. This isn't like the typical American Christmas idea of I want a pony and a red wagon and a BB gun, and I can have all the good things, and yay, more is better. The ancient worldview here is the idea that each of these things, being its own organism, has the things that it will tolerate and the things it won't tolerate. What are the blind spots of a given epoch versus what are the areas of its core focus that it tries to pay attention to? These things are different from one epoch to the next, and those differences create incompatibilities. So what we're trying to learn is how not to commit ourselves to one worldview, but to learn to move from one worldview to another so that we can change where our blind spots are and maybe sometimes bring into visibility something that under the previous worldview that we were thinking in terms of we couldn't see at all, or we saw only in a very distorted way. We want to try to use these different worldviews for their strengths and weaknesses, and thereby fully understand where we stand in history and how our minds work. It's been a it's been a fascinating journey so far in these 102 weeks. Before we go to the text, let me go to the hands we have up. Let's start with Stephen. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm a bit curious now. This is the ancient Greek, well, maybe it was a few philosophers, this particular warning against the ego. How, I don't know, we don't seem to see this warning being aired in almost apparently a public sense. So obviously, I don't know if we really see it in the late Roman Empire. I don't know if we see it in the medieval era. And I don't know if we see it in modern times. And I mean by that, that we see warnings against the ego if you go to your old-fashioned church. Particularly older people will warn you against the ego. Younger people think ego is not a dirty word. And so the warnings against the ego weren't being vocalized, apparently, as much as they were in this particular epoch. And I'd be curious to see, were there any public warnings against the ego in later epochs? Because look now, is anybody saying to all these crazy politicians working on World War III that you've got an ego problem? No one would dare say it. The news wouldn't dare say it. Hey, dude, you got an ego problem. You'd be slapped around psychologically straight away, wouldn't you? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, you see it with our approach to like school pride, patriotic pride. Pride is a good thing. You're supposed to take pride in yourself. You're supposed to have self-esteem. And our idea of self-esteem is not building a lifetime of, a good life in service to others and making the world a better place. Our idea of pride is the feeling of pride. You just have to feel it, which is why we use, psychoactive drugs prescribed widely for children to try to up their feelings of self-esteem to compensate for, living in a world that's giving them no real authentic source of it. That kind of pride, which is closely linked to ego, was exactly the thing that serious medieval theologians picked out as the worst of the seven deadly sins. Said pride is the father of all the other sins. It's where you live an unbalanced life, where you loom large to yourself, so large that other people shrink to the point that you don't take them into account sufficiently. That the Greeks understood that there's supposed to be a balance between agency and contingency, between the one and the many, between yourself and others. You can't neglect either one, and they have to be organized into a dialectic. But in the modern world, we don't think with that level of sophistication. And even if we did, you're right, we wouldn't use it to critique ego and pride. I think the clearest example is here's Heraclitus saying it would not be better if men got exactly what they wanted. Your desire is the problem. The things that you want are the problem. And the nature of the problem is not that you want it per se. Like, it's not to say, and that's the problem with cats, and that's the problem with birds, and that's the problem with fishes. No, it's that Homo sapiens has a specific problem to our species. And our problem is that our desires often have nothing to do with what's good for us. What a cat wants, or a bird wants, or a tree wants has a lot to do with what's healthy for it, or for its population in general. But we have that same capacity to utterly be fascinated and desire things and want them and work for them, and yet it's disconnected from any kind of, you know, genuine health or vitality. And that's what makes desire and ego, according to the ancients, that's what makes desire and ego in Homo sapiens such a threat. Just because somebody wants something doesn't mean it's good for them. In fact, 99 times out of 100, they want the wrong thing. And when they do want the right thing, they might not be able to distinguish that from all the wrong things. They might prioritize badly and say, well, I'm sure I'd like to eat, but I'm gonna buy this new car instead. I really want it because it's so cool. And yeah, my kids will go hungry, but so what? This kind of imbalance, this lack of, I think about the way they see that there's magnetite in the brains of migrating birds that allow them to orient north and south, figure out which way to go. They've learned now since they first discovered the magnetite in birds' brains. They've learned that they also memorize landmarks. They have to be shown the route by their parents and elders first before they can do it in subsequent years by themselves. But they also have like a little, the equivalent of a lodestone or there's some kind of sense that we're missing so that they can tell north from south. I think what the ancients want us to understand is that there's some other compass in the brain for animals that allows them to orient towards what's healthy, what leads to vitality and health. And we're missing that compass. Just like we're missing the magnetite, we're also missing the other compass, so that we can't distinguish a healthy desire from an unhealthy desire. They look the same to us. So ego, pride, the ancients said, well, the way that you solve that problem is you study nature closely and you try to figure out what essentially makes things work. What are their gifts? What are their orientations? And then you take those lessons back to Homo sapiens and say, now in our personal lives, in our family lives, in the government of our polis, we want to mimic those patterns as closely as we can and be guided by them, so that will give us a fighting chance to figure out which direction lies health and vitality. But moderns say, no, it's not a problem. Whatever you want, it's good. If you want it, form a committee and get a vote going and see if you can make it happen. Why not? No matter what your desire is, if you can get the votes for it or collect the money or what other modern form of power we see, then you should have it. That's what moderns believe. Go for it. Live your dream. If your dream is to exterminate tens of millions of people, go for it. Be a dreamer, make it happen. This is the shallowness of the modern approach to our desires. It's like no discrimination at all between the healthy and the unhealthy. So I'm with you, Stephen. I think what you put your finger on is one of the most core issues about the difference between the ancient worldview and the modern worldview. The ancients were obsessed with this problem and trying to solve it. And the moderns say it's not a problem at all. We're all born free and wise and smart and objective. And that's our birthright as moderns. Look, it's in the name. See how modern we are. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was struck by the way you encapsulated the epochs. Also by Hegel's thing about the movement of history. Because it seems to me at the bottom of it, there's a narrative structure that seems like a tragedy. You start somewhere, you go up to a zenith, you come down, and you're in tragedy. Whether that's in Sophocles, or whether that's in what's his name? Shakespeare, or even modern writers like Chekhov and so forth. It almost seemed like this tragic structure is the structure of human beings, that we always come off in this tragic ending, in a sense, because Hegel does say the hour maneuver takes flight at dusk, right? Another what is already getting kind of dark, okay? So if that is the case, I wonder whether anybody has thought of, well, first of all, I'm thinking there's a deep relationship between literature and philosophy, because literature is about that narrative structure. And it's it's not by accidents that the tragic dramas, the tragic plays, has captivated us, even though it ends tragically rather than comedies. Has anybody thought of creating a structure of passing the baton at the zenith of relationships rather than at the very desperate moment, the desperate hours that creates a structure of this sort of narrative? Now, of course, if you pass the baton off at the height of a thing, then I guess you're passing off to the next era. It's going to go down before it gets to be a comedy. And so I just wonder whether, because I don't think that's by accident, that's the way history has encapsulated us, the fall of Rome, not the height of the moment and then pass it the baton to the medievals and so forth, but at the end of it, but everything's gone bad. So we have deep within us, if that's true, a deep structure in which the way we see the world, and we're not going to get motivated until the desperate hours strike. Because in the zenith, hey, everything is fine. We're doing well. I mean, like, what's your problem? So why is philosophers, if that's the case, as well as literary people, focus so much on the tragic drama as being somehow more authentic and more powerful than the comedies? Now, we do like comedies, but it's just sort of like, it's kind of like eating a good ice cream cone. I mean, like, yeah, that's good. It really tickles our fancy, but somehow the tragic narrative strikes us like, yeah, that is what life is all about. And that's what the human structure is. That's what history is. So I'm just interested that nobody ever thought of, let's say, let's pass the baton now before we fall apart to all eras apparent in the future. So maybe they will continue the rise rather than it goes through this cycle. Of course, it also embeds the cyclically nature within the structure. So yeah, it's very, very interesting. Why didn't Hegel try to spin it in such a way that we're going to turn this curve upside down, and then we will begin a new epoch of modern enlightenment. Let's put it that way. Okay, that's it. Phil, could you say something about?
You bet. You bet. So there's a couple of problems. And one of them is most people don't even know they're living in an epoch or that they have a worldview. They think that they see things the way they are. And there's nothing complicated going on in their brain. It's not until people run into optical illusions that they begin to question the nature of seeing. Otherwise, they think seeing is the truth just comes to me and then I have it. And that's all there is to it. There's nothing more. The same goes for thinking. People think that when they think, they just, find the truth. They just think about it and then they know what's true. And how that happens or whether it's even happening, they don't like to think about that stuff. Thinking about thinking, which is one of the topics of philosophy, epistemology, is really hard. It's very hard because you're trying to get the brain to do something that it naturally doesn't want to do. What the brain wants to do is either of two things: either immerse ourselves in the flow of experience, live each day as though it's your last, don't forget to enjoy the moment, all those bumper sticker, things that we've read. That's incredibly rewarding, right? To be plugged into life. It makes you feel alive. That's where all the juice is. So most people never want to leave that mode of existence. And the only way you're going to think thoughts like, I wonder if my epoch has tragic flaws that need to be overcome, and maybe it would be better if we hopped out of this one while it's at its peak before it starts to go down. These are the sorts of thoughts most people simply can't think. They just can't. It involves distancing themselves too much from the intensity of an experiential life. And it feels, therefore, it carries a bit of the feeling of death and decay and depression with it. You know, you're losing something precious and vitalizing. The rest of the rest of the majority of people, you know, who have for their own reasons negated that mode in themselves, pushed away from it, they become intellectuals, they become followers of systems, you know, people who want to know what their rank is, you know, want to know, you know, when they get their next promotion, what do they have to do to earn it. That whole structured systematic life of abstraction, you know, immersion not in the reality of life, but immersion in the systems created by people. You know, there you become very goal oriented. You know, I'm 3 years away from retirement, or I'm 2 years away from getting my promotion. Once I get my promotion, I'll be able to afford a better house. I can't do that right now. My current house is not meeting my needs. I really need to do the things that will get me to that promotion. Now, all the things that we think about paying bills and getting the health care that we need and all that stuff, it's very pragmatic and goal oriented. So the problem with being at the peak of an epoch of history is that that's when that epoch and that worldview are working at their best. They weren't working as well in the beginning. In the beginning, the whole motivation was the old system was so bad, anything was better than that. And so we move on to the new replacement. But now that we've climbed to the peak, you know, you look around and you say, everything seems to be working. I really will get my promotion in 2 years. And then I can move into that new house. Why on earth would I rock the boat when the golden ring is almost in my grasp? You know, so everybody who's stuck in that mode of thought, they feel they have too much to lose by making change. There's a Roman quote about that too.
Why can't you, when you're at your peak, switch from a tragic structure, okay, as tragic plot, to a melodrama? All the ups and downs of life, you know. I mean, it's like at least you're sort of meandering in the plateau rather than, oh my gosh, we come to the end, we're falling off the cliff. I mean, it seems like that's interesting why we didn't just switch to a melodrama. Yeah, there are tragic moments, but there are comic moments, you know. That's how life goes, you know. There's promotions, there's demotions, there's you being fired, all that. So it seems like the melodrama, in some sense, it's the in-between period, you know, of like a modernity, or you know, probably throughout the epoch, they probably think that they could keep this going at least for a while, and they do.
Yeah.
They do keep it for a while, you know.
It's so all-encompassing is the issue, right?
Yeah.
When you're immersed in either of those two modes, it takes everything you've got. It's fully engrossing. And really, this is where the film The Matrix is really helpful. You know, you see the way that until he's forced to confront the artificiality of his life, he absolutely is inhabiting it. There may be parts of it that he's not satisfied with. He may be unhappy and a night owl and things like that, but he's still immersed in it, and it feels real to him. And even when he's told that it's not real, and he sees that he's in trouble and he needs to escape, and all he has to do is walk out on the ledge, he still can't do it. It still feels too real. He's still afraid he'll fall. All of that stuff is just completely plugging right into this Hegelian zeitgeist and its power over us. You know, these modes are as addictive as heroin or nicotine. I mean, they're really all engrossing. So people who look at these things from a philosophical long-term perspective are doing something very contra-natural. It's very hard, very difficult, very uncomfortable. And, you know, the only way that Athens was able to get roughly a third of its population to behave that way, if assuming their estimates are right. I don't know if they are, but let's assume that they are. The only way they were able to do it is that every facet of their culture had been structured to make it as easy as possible to move in that direction, and to talk relentlessly about issues of the addictive nature of the other two character types, and you know how important it is to grow out of that. How you don't want to be an infant psychologically. You want to de-infantilize yourself and try to develop. You know, we do the opposite. Everything we have infantilizes people. You know, move along, move along. We'll take care of the problems. Don't worry your little head about what's happening. Just go with the flow, right? Don't ask questions. You wouldn't want to get in trouble. Trouble for moderns, trouble is the scariest of all things, right? Nobody wants to get in trouble because trouble means you might not be able to pay your rent. So, you know, and that means homelessness and death. And we don't want that. So there are these ways in which the modern world makes it as hard as possible to do what the Athenians were trying as hard as possible to make easy, even though they never succeeded in getting the majority of their population either. I mean, what you're asking are the great questions, right? But there aren't any easy answers. So I think let's actually go to the text then. So this is paragraph 2, part 1. And he starts out saying, the ultimate stress upon an aristocratic order is the discontent of those excluded from its highest privileges. Now, for those who are just joining us, there's the first warning here is that Kenneth Smith doesn't write using standard English definitions. If a word seems loaded, like aristocratic or ultimate, it almost certainly doesn't mean what the dictionary says it means. It almost certainly means in some way the opposite of what we think it means. So for purposes here, I'm gonna pick out the word aristocratic. This is probably the most important place in which the modern definition and the ancient definition are opposites. In his book on governments, on politics and the Athenian constitution, you know, I've said this in past weeks, but I'm going to repeat it for the people who are new. Aristotle distinguishes between good forms of government and bad forms of government. And he says there are 3 good forms of government and 3 bad forms of government. And the problem is that on the surface, they're paired up. So the good and bad rule by a single person look very much alike from the outside. There's one guy and he's in charge. But one of them is bad and one of them is good. And how do you tell them apart? Similarly, the rule by a few. And by the way, going back to the first one, the bad one is a tyranny and the good one is an is a kingship. Is a kingship. And then the rule by the few, the good form is an aristocracy and the bad form is an oligarchy. And an oligarchy is a rule by, it just happens to be a small number of people. An aristocracy is a rule by a group of aristoi, you know, people of the aristic character type. And to the Greeks, those are the people who are willing to set aside their self-interest. And not willing to, but they need to. They have a visceral need to set aside their self-interest and set aside their schematized ideological thinking and really try to grapple with the problems of what's good for the society. If they do that, then they're an aristocracy. And if they don't do that, they're merely an oligarchy. The same is true for the tyranny versus the kingship. You got a guy, he calls himself king, but he thinks about his own appetites, or he thinks about rules and systems and so on. Well, then he's not a king at all. He's a tyrant, right? Only if he's an aristos, if he's the character type that can set aside those addictive basal preoccupations and focus on the health and the good of the community, only then is he a king, and only then do you have a kingdom. And he says the same is true for rule by the many. He says the division in rule by the many, the bad form is democracy, and that just means a bunch of jerks get together and vote on what they want to do, and you know they aren't aristoi. They're all voting based on their appetites and their goals and their desires. It's nothing to do with what's good for the civilization. Versus, and I don't remember the word he uses. I can't remember if he uses the word republic or if he uses some other word. I really have to open it up and look again. But he's got a different word that he uses when a democracy is a democracy of aristoi. It's people who can set aside those basal concerns and focus on the good of the whole. Then the majority is the good form of majority rule. So when we see this sentence, the ultimate stress upon an aristocratic order, he's not saying, oh, let's you know, death to the kings, let's overthrow the few who are sticking it to the many. That's not what he's talking about at all. He's saying if you have managed to get Aristotle's good form of government, the middle one, in which it's ruled by the few, but the few are the ones who actually care about the health of the society and the people, and they're trying to make a good government. The ultimate stress on that is caused by the discontent of those who are excluded from its highest privileges. That is, the people who aren't allowed to put their hands on the steering wheel because they're con artists and you know and predators, those people will tear apart an aristocratic order because they don't see any reason why they shouldn't be driving. They're like that. I was describing this to on a walk I had the other day. You know that there's, you know, from school there's always at least one weedy, scrawny kid who brags to everybody how strong he is. And if anybody ever talks about, yeah, I ran this track meet and I came in second, I'm so proud, he'll say, well, I could have won. I could, if I'd done that, I would have won. And then if somebody else comes by and, you know, they win the spelling bee, he's like, I could have won that. I spell better than anybody. He's like the guy who doesn't understand himself and his limitations. This is going back to what Stephen was talking about. His ego is so big that he can't stand to acknowledge anybody else's strengths. He always has to put everybody else down. And he thinks everything would be better if he got to make all the decisions. So this is who we're talking about in this opening section. We're not talking about slavery and how the slaves are discontented because they're treated like shit. We're talking about the egotist who isn't allowed to prey on vulnerable people, and as a result thinks the government's unfair, and he wants to get in charge so that he can, you know, steal candy from babies and rip off the gullible. This is the kind of thing that we're talking about in this structure, and it's relevant because the time frame of the collapse of the Athenian order is the time frame from the time Solon institutes his changes to the Athenian constitution that gives the vote to people who engage in trade. And he invites people from all over the Mediterranean to come join Athens and become this enormous trading fleet that's going to, you know, it's going to make Athens the richest polis in all of Greece. But of course, the price is now the majority voting bloc is full of people who are used to conning each other. All they can think about is how do they up their profit margin. And they drag Athens into a war that destroys Athens and, you know, pulls all of Greece into a vast civil war. And they do that because they can't imagine thinking about the good of the whole. There's no such thing for them. All they can imagine is, if I could get my hands on the steering wheel, I could make so much more money. You know, it's like in the United States. You know, the FDA gets taken over by drug companies. The EPA gets taken over by polluters. Every government agency, you know, gets infested by the very people it's supposed to be regulating, because the people being regulated don't want to be regulated. They're like, sure, you know, I may be a child molester who runs around, you know, relentlessly attacking children, but I don't see why I should have to follow the rules of the child molester, you know, management agency that tries to stop me from doing that. It's not fair. It's a bad government because it won't let me be in charge. Because let me tell you, if I were in charge, I could really get what I want. These are the kind of people we're talking about here, right? This is what makes Kenneth so hard to read. Because you could easily read this as saying this is some sort of, you know, apologetics for slave owners about how unfair it is that, you know, the slaves want to overthrow the government. That's not at all what he's talking about here. He's talking about, how did Athens fall from being a city-state that most of Greece admired because of the way that it focused on the development of the people and negotiation through persuasion and so on. It devolved into a tyrant of a city-state that ran around beating up other city-states to get what it wanted, and basically not even bothering with rhetoric to try to make it seem like, you know, they were doing something good, but even just outright admitting you should submit because we're stronger than you are, and we're going to bully you. And we'll bully you less if you do what we want. So do what we want. Thucydides captures that speech in the history of the Peloponnesian War, and it's a shocking moment, because Athens has fallen so far that to them that makes sense. The wrong people, those excluded, previously excluded from the highest privileges, are now able to steer the ship of Athens, and they steer it into catastrophe. The rest of the sentence goes, for the principles that explain its system of order are truly esoteric matters, comprehensible in a complete degree only to those aristoi, whose business it is to secure the polis's foundations. So principles here, of course, this has nothing to do with the modern empty rhetoric of ideals where we say, gosh, it would be nice if we're nice to each other. but instead I'm going to stick you up with my gun and take your money, but I'll tell you that I'm all about freedom. That's my ideal. Principles actually guide behavior. It's a principled majority that makes up the good form of majority rule in Aristotle's schema. It's a principled minority that makes up the good form of minority rule in Aristotle's schema. And it's a principled individual who makes up the good form of individual rule in Aristotle's schema. Principles are the missing ingredient, when you get to the bad form of government. Principles are what say, there's something bigger than my ego. There's something bigger than the ideologies I subscribe to. And that is, how does nature actually work? What are the principles that make it a great harmony that's been going for billions of years and that's created everything we see around us? And how can I organize my society according to those same principles? Whatever those principles are, I'm going to let them override my personal appetites. I'm going to let them override my favorite ideologies. If I say, well, man, I could really get what I want if I did the vote this way, but I look at the principle and it says, no, you can't do it that way. Well, then I'm going to set aside what I wanted to do and follow the principle. This is what he's talking about. And he's saying the issue is that, and this is where we go back to Heraclitus, right? Nature loves to hide. One of my favorite fragments from Heraclitus. The principles that make nature go are the thing that like to hide. I mean, you look out the window, you can see the leaves and the flowers and the bees and the birds. They're just right there on the surface. Nature loves to hide doesn't make any sense if that's what you're talking about. But in many places, Heraclitus talks about the idea that nature is made up of a hidden harmony, a deeper harmony below the surface. Why do the trees produce flowers? And then there's these pollinators that seem to want to get into the flowers and spread the pollen around. How did that ever come to happen as a great dance of nature? Well, that's the hidden harmony Heraclitus is talking about. And it's organized according to deep principles of nature that we don't even have names for. We struggle to clearly explain how nature pulls this off. And so when he says they're esoteric matters, of course, esoteric means hidden. These are things that are not on the surface, that are not easy to spot. And as a result, most people aren't even going to notice them or care about them. And only people who have the kind of character that makes them discontented with the life of appetite and discontented with the life of ideology, those are the only people who are going to do the work that's required to try to search for and attach themselves to these deeper principles, because it's so much work. It's so hard. And it's not rewarding in either of the trivial ways that most people seek their rewards from. So this is what he's talking about here. He's saying there is a character. The ancient Greeks believed there is a character type. You can find it naturally in Homo sapiens. It is the mature adult form of the human mind that we're supposed to develop into. And that mature adult form is the only one that you can trust, to a limited extent, but trust to try to focus on finding and following these principles. Everybody else diverges off the path of development into their appetites and experiences on the one hand, and their ideologies and systems of thinking on the other. They don't go the rest of the way, and so they can't govern. Yeah, Stephen says in the chat, Nietzsche on envy. And Nietzsche's got some great writing on envy. And I think it's from Nietzsche that Kenneth gets the line: the people who lack the character to govern, the people who have the kind of character that would make them a menace if they held offices of governance, what they feel towards the people who govern them is resentment. The child molester resents that he's not allowed to molest children. The con artist resents that he's not allowed to con the rubes. The predator resents that he's not allowed to prey upon the majority of the population. They resent the people who have them on a leash, because they feel like there's no valid reason why they shouldn't be allowed to get what they want, no matter what it does to other people or even themselves. But what the people who govern, the aristoi, what they feel towards these predators and con artists and so on is contempt. They feel contempt in the ancient Greek worldview, because they say it's disgusting the way that you want to hurt other people. It's disgusting the way you want to wreck everything for short-term gain. It's revolting. It makes me feel sick. So there's this hostility between the two. It's like the specific form of contempt is not not the medieval form of contempt of, and therefore I shall damn you to hell where you'll be tortured for all eternity. That's a medieval thing. That's not an ancient thing. It's the contempt you feel if you come in and your 1-year-old is eating poop. And you're like, oh, for the love of God, get that out of your mouth. Get that out of your mouth. Every parent, and frankly, people who raise pets, has had to say it sometime. Oh, for the love of God, get that out of your mouth. That feeling of mixed contempt and alarm. that's the feeling we're talking about that an Aristos feels when they interrupt some con artist in the middle of conning people out of their retirements. It's like, take your hands out of that savings account. What is wrong with you? You people, it's like, the way you react. Anyway, Phil, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, what's in my mind is that it seems like it's very difficult to get through somebody who achieved at the moment great success. Okay, and because like that's the moment when you should begin to really penetrate and ask yourself, am I really doing the right thing? Because it seems to be successful. Let's keep doing it. I was struck by Aeschylus, a play called The Persians. This was written after the Battle of Thermopylae, when Athens and Sparta and some other Greek states joined in together to defeat really an undefeatable army of what's his name? Well, and so I thought at first when I heard about this play called The Persians, I thought Aeschylus had written it to address to the Persians themselves. And the historian corrected me and says, yeah, it was actually maybe performed in Persia, but what she was very interested in is like, how did it affect the Athenians? Because that's what's addressed at. And it seems like with the success of the war against Xerxes, which is an undefeatable army to begin with, well, we know that for sure, that Athens, the great warriors, and politicians, was just full of themselves because they had collected taxes from the other Greek states in order to win this victory. I mean, in other words, it was a kind of alliance. But after they've done it, this money is pretty damn good. Instead of giving it back to them, the war's over, like whatever. Hey, let's keep this because we could keep having success, right? And Aeschylus apparently wrote it. It's like, you're in danger of becoming the Persians. And nobody's going to listen to it because, like, what the hell are you talking about? We just defeated the Persians. What greater than the Persians? And it wasn't until later, I guess when Sparta defeated Athens that people began to have some sense like, yeah, maybe we were too full of ourselves. But at the moment when you had achieved great success, said, oh, this is going to continue, I mean, the psychology of individuals as well as groups is that way. Like, I just made $1 million, like let's do it some more, whatever it is that acquires success. That's the moment you say, maybe the market will turn down, I just be a little bit more careful, because some of that could just be a fluke, an accident, and whatever, a decisive moment. So in some sense, I wonder if Aeschylus should have wrote it a little bit later so that people were ready to hear what he had to say, that they are becoming the Persians rather than, the risen Greeks, in that sense. So maybe timing has a lot to do with it, You can only say it to people who are ready to listen. Because when they're met with just great success, you're not going to tell them, no, your idea about the marker, your idea about writing more novels like that or whatever, I mean, forget about it. You know? They're not going to do that. I mean, it's like success breeds success. So, yeah, I wonder whether that's part of our problem is that, you know, maybe we should understand that what follows success is failure. I always remember this Chinese general who won a great victory. And instead of celebrating, you know, his soldiers found him crying, right? He says, he says something like, it's simply a matter of time that I will be at the other end. So he was not only crying for the guy that lost, but he was crying for himself because that will be his destiny. So in some sense, it's hard, it's hard to understand that there is a destiny that's hidden within the structure. And that's I think that's what harmony does. I think that's why Plato put so much emphasis on music as the first tool to educate people in some sense, because it doesn't teach you just the melodies, it teaches you the harmonies, you know, that's hidden within the structure itself. So yeah, I think that's just hard to teach for people, you know. Don't tell a person, you know, who successful, stop it, you know. You wait till a moment when, you know, when things begin to be shaky, then maybe that's time to tell them, you know, you ought to cut back a little bit, you know. That's my attempt to get some wisdom in the timing.
Thank you, Phil. That's a great observation. Yeah, you know, Aeschylus, of course, is the one who gave us the famous quote that Bobby Kennedy used on his funeral oration for Martin Luther King Jr. when he said, you know, it's Aeschylus who teaches us that drop by drop wisdom is distilled from pain, you know, and that it's not the nature of Homo sapiens to be wise. We are creatures of enthusiasms, but 99 out of 100 of our enthusiasms point the wrong direction, and we do the craziest things with incredible conviction, and then only later discover that we've led ourselves into catastrophe. And so, you know, the wisdom of Aeschylus, I really want to read the Persians. I've never read it. I've read about it. I've never read it myself, and it's highly relevant. I mean, the connection you're making between this and the Peloponnesian War is right on. That's exactly what F.M. Cornford says in Thucydides Myth Historicus. I put the link there for you, anyone who wants to read it. You can get it for free at the Internet Archive and read it. This is where Cornford critiques why did Thucydides fail to adequately explain the causes of the Peloponnesian War, and he talks about Solon's reform of the constitution and giving the vote to all the traders and businessmen, and what that did to the course of Athenian, you know, decision making. You know, in it he talks about the way that, you know, Thucydides is in a difficult position because he's basically inventing the field of history. Before that, everybody's always done history as drama or tragedy or, you know, a story. Yeah, or in the case of Herodotus, as, you know, crazy stories that I heard from Bob, you know, when passing along the gossip, you know. And so Thucydides is really inventing the idea of you should double check your sources, make sure that you're describing something that really happened, make sure you're describing it accurately. I mean, everything he sets out to do is pretty amazing. And it makes it all the more amazing that at the end of that book, he still hasn't actually explained the causes. He said in the opening, the one reason I wrote this book is to explain the causes. And you get to the end, there's nothing we recognize as an explanation of the causes. And Cornford's, you know, writes this book to answer that question. How can a guy so good at what he's doing and so focused on this one question not answer it? And the rest of you have heard this already. You know, we've talked about it a month ago, but for those who are new to the calls. And what he concludes is that Thucydides does think he answered the causes, but he didn't answer them the way we would, using a modern approach to history. He answers it the way Aeschylus would. And he describes the tragedy of Athens in terms of the character of the polis, in the same way that Aeschylus describes the character of his protagonists, you know, in like the Agamemnon, and how the one guy has these tragic flaws and how they arise and how they play out step by step, leading to his destruction, is exactly the same thing to Athens. Thucydides lays it out with the exact same Aeschylean steps. You know, there's Elpis, you know, that kind of overweening hope. There's hubris. There's eros. There's all the stages that Aeschylus has. His choir, you know, Aeschylus's chorus of the different, you know, aspects of human psychology, who are on the second stage, stepping forward and saying things in between the lead characters saying things to reveal the drama inside the mind. In the same way, Thucydides is doing that inside the mind of Athens. And it's the exact same cast in the chorus in the history of the Peloponnesian War, you know, and it follows the exact same sequence. So he thought he'd explained it, because he's basically saying, you know, the character of Athens had changed and had become the kind of character that leads you into specifically into these sorts of tragedies. Now, a modern reader can't see any of that. We weren't raised on Aeschylus, right? We don't think that way. We want to know about the, you know, where was the military power, or what was the economic conditions, or, you know, someone in a Marxist analysis wants to read about the class struggle. Everybody's got their system of processing history, and, you know, as a result, we completely miss Thucydides' own method of processing history. But I think, yeah, Cornford would agree with you 100%, Phil. I mean, what he sees is this Aeschylean tragedy unfolding. And the cause, you're right, he ascribes it directly to the events that, you know, Aeschylus is documenting in the Persians, which makes it, frankly, now, I don't know why it took me this long. It's like a month and a half. I should have occurred to me maybe 2 months ago. The next thing I need to read is The Persians by Aeschylus. It's the perfect follow-up to this book by Cornford, because that's where I'll see, you know, an Aeschylean take on the events that lead, that, you know, that incite the Peloponnesian War by setting up the tragedy of the Delian League and Athens' refusal to let go. So thank you for that. Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, this is fantastic. It's so good to be here. I'm going to do the same thing I do every time. I want to thank all the human beings for being amazing and participating. I see so many different shapes and faces and colors, and that rich diversity is what I value in terms of a healthy, beautiful discussion with richness and complexity, ultimately leading to some sort of robust discussion. So I love it. I just want to say thanks for letting me participate, and it's really a pleasure to be here. That being said, I have some specific things to mention about Aeschylus, and I think it's really a wonderful historical approach, this method of an analysis that he's describing, his causation, and yet he tells a story instead of what we're used to, something like in modern times, like bullet points, or I would call objects of analysis, Marxism or capitalism or military flanking, whatever. These are what we would in modern times be much more analytical in a decontextualized way. And anytime you're trying to communicate or describe anything, I fully believe that it's all about describing things, and description is all about telling stories. You have to have, so in our modern time, when we use these analytical objects, such as Marxism or capitalism or whatever, neoliberalism, whatever you want to talk about, the system, you used a nice word, a system, that's still a type of object. And really within the framework of telling a story, that's like a prop. It's just a prop. It's, you know, move the prop, what's it doing, how's it behaving. But props are useless unless you have a, you know, like a story with characters and what are they doing? What does this mean? Right. And so the further you go back in history, especially in religious types of texts, when they want to do the same thing, prophets want to analyze what's wrong with the Hebrews or the Egyptians, they don't list off bullet points. They're telling stories. So how do stories relate to causes? Well, that's really natural, because the way we understand anything is in the framework of a story. And a story is really easily defined by the props, that's the objects, and the set, which is we would call an environment. So you have to have objects interacting with their environment. And in this abstract sort of way, it's really awful. It doesn't make any sense. And to some degree, his story is really sad for us. Being so far away from it, we can't relate to his stories that he's telling us in the personal way that we might want to. But if the audience that he's talking about in his contemporary times, this is exactly what they would relate to. This is the ideal form of communication for them. He's coming to his audience in a way that his audience wants and needs, right? If he were to pull out some modern weird thing for them of analytical objects, they would just tune out. And so this is about, again, framing a story using objects. In this case, I would say the general characterization that I love about history that proves so well here is the further you go back in time, the more description is in the form of metaphor or simile. And again, like a story being compared to another story. While in modern times, if we're going to tell a story, we're going to break it all down in what we call deconstructual, I can't say the word very well, deconstruction of the objects, and the pretty much you're taking the characters in the play and you're taking the object in the play and you're writing some sort of essay where you describe each character individually, each object individually, and you analyze it with this more modern piecemeal, break it apart thing and then put it back together. But in a totally different sort of a framework that I really like to study about how the mind works is when we deconstruct things, they lose meaning. And it's almost like Humpty Dumpty that falls off the wall. You can't put it back together in the same way. The most modern really story that exemplifies this false analytical approach where if I can just take apart the parts of the clock, I can put it back together. Well, this is not a clock. It's a story. It's a moving, living thing. And again, it's very much like Frankenstein's monster. And the failure here is that we think we can take all these objects and take them apart and then put it back together. And look at my Frankenstein's monster. It's a regular human. And you're like, no, this doesn't match up to the human that I was expecting. So it's really actually better in a lot of ways. And again, it's the nature of something in another type of language that I'm not sure if we use here, but this is the language of neuroscience or medicine or other types of science where it's specificity versus sensitivity. You can think of specificity as zooming in on an object, very, very, all the details of the object, what it's like. It's like a mountain. You're going to look at the mountain. Well, I'm going to start here. I'm going to go zoom in all the way. I'm going to look at the molecular structure. I'm going to zoom in further, and I'm going to look at what the protons, the electrons. But at this point, you don't have a mountain anymore. So the key is to zoom back out and scale it and see, I see the mountain again. And that's sensitivity, right? The frame, the context, literally the frame of the picture is going to give us the story of that mountain. And then you can run it through forward with time with like, I understand what the molecules are doing, whatever. But you have to relate the sensitivity to the specificity. And in general, back then, they had a lot less specificity. And it made a lot of sense that they didn't have the modern science that we have that was really universally accepted in terms of math or language even, or just objects like ideas like atoms or whatever you want to call it, modern science that we universally use. It makes more sense. And a lot of times you gain a lot more meaning, even though you lose specificity, when you can compare like one person to another type of person, as opposed to deconstruct the human into his components. That's usually where you lose your audience. When he's talking about like Fred is like Eric because Fred is a thief and Eric is also a thief, like, I get it now. Even though there may be one guy stealing bananas and the other guy stealing watermelons, right? I get the process of stealing, the story of that somebody else had a watermelon and he took it, So this is what he's really doing. He's telling us a story and he's using his method of description, which is heavily grounded in simile and metaphor and a lot less in objects. But again, I think the level of specificity, if we're really going to try to analyze him in his context, his level of specificity, like we're describing, is an invention, this sort of analytical approach. I love what you're saying. Like he's just not just doing Herodotus, like, Bob said that, so I'm going to tell you what Bob said, right? He's like, well, I wonder, did Bob actually say that? Let me go check some sources and figure it out. That's what we call in the fisherman's adage, trust but verify, right? He's trying to verify, even though it's not to the level of verification that we expect now. He's doing something that's really quite novel that you can imagine that no one else is specifying on his level. And to some degree, to specify on this level is really radical and actually really risky because his audience could just check out. It's too specific. It's too much. And our day sees it so the opposite. We see it as too sensitive. It's not specific enough. And it really, really, again, I'm making a hypothesis that is well grounded in a lot of linguistics and modern, the postmodernist approach to deconstructionalism is how we've deconstructed everything. This is a generally accepted approach, but it's still a hypothesis that modern day is stuck in a world of specificity, objects that are disparate, not connected well to each other. And that's because it's like our play, instead of having a reasonable amount of props and a reasonable amount of characters, there's like a flood of objects, too many props. And it's like, I don't know the meaning of this story anymore. So it's hard for us to relate, but really I want to make a final statement about how amazing of a bold risk taker he is by actually giving us, or giving his people, more specificity than they probably can handle. But at the same time, they need to handle more. And in this case, this is very much more like a prophet, or I said to say it, even a scientist now. He's telling us information that we don't know about. And anytime you're introduced to things you don't know about, the natural thing that happens in the brain, if anybody wants some neuroscience, is what happens when you're approaching the unknown. And that releases immediately, the signal in the brain is basically error signals, like warning cells, like, oh, something's happening. I don't know what's happening. I'm getting confused. That's novelty. And unless it's couched with some other, like, somebody making you feel safe or exciting, like there's a new sandwich or whatever, something that's fun, like a certain type of surprise versus anxiety. And this is not surprise. This is anxiety. He's a doomsayer. He's trying to say all the bad things. So immediately the error signals are going off in the brain. And this is the cocktail in the brain that does this is you have something called noradrenaline, which is adrenaline, and that releases anxiety. And you have another thing called acetylcholine, which brings focus to that anxiety. And the other happy feelings of dopamine and serotonin. Dopamine is the feeling of reward for success and wanting more of something. This lowers in the brain. And then you have something also called serotonin, which is the molecule of the present feeling, really general feeling comfortable, which is associated with homeostasis. So homeostasis is the exact opposite of what's happening. And we feel scared and upset when we leave homeostasis, which means not only are we going to not like the information that Aeschylus is presenting, we're also really going to reject the messenger. This is the case of shoot the messenger because we don't like the message. And he really probably intuitively was a very smart guy that recognized that I'm going to tell this stuff to these people and they're going to hate it. So how am I going to present it in a way that's still relatable? And he made a nice equation. And again, I want to take this back to Phil. I missed a lot, but the last thing I heard was like 45 minutes ago. This relationship in Go between strategy and tactics. And I don't really study this too much in the formal sense, but I have my own version of it, which is entirely based on the Sun Tzu's Art of War, which is, again, telling stories. And the story is know your enemy and know yourself. And then in order to do that, you have to make decisions and figure out stuff. And the stuff you figure out ahead of time, all the calculations, he calls it, you're going to do ahead of time, that's called strategy. That's the stuff I do beforehand. And I practice whatever strategy is. That's my tactics, the actual doing of things on the battlefield. What you do in the moment is a tactic. And so the idea is the great general can marry all the great strategy, comes with more calculations than his enemy, but he's also able to apply that strategy in forms of tactics on the battlefield. And the measurement of a tactic going well in modern army, it's the exact same way, is just training. How well you can do the tactic is just training. You train to do the tactic, and it's what's called unconscious confidence or unconscious knowledge. Basically, when some guy throws a spear at you, you don't have to think, oh, do I need to pick up my shield and put it over my face? You just like, boom, oh, there's the shield. And the faster you can do that, the more you can defend against the spear. And this is what you practice ahead of time. And so the application of tactics on the battlefield is just training. It's just training what you've trained for. And what you decide to train for ahead of time is your strategy. And so Aeschylus is doing this. He's like, okay, I got to figure out a strategy of communicating these causes to this group that really don't want to hear these causes. So he writes it. These are his tactics, what he writes down. And so in a modern sense, it's really interesting. We never have access from history, even if you imagine history is perfect, which it's far from. Even if we have perfect information to be able to watch the movie of Aeschylus writing it down, we don't get into his head. We have no access to his strategy. We can piece it together by seeing his tactics, what he wrote about. So a lot of what I'm doing is just reimagining what his strategy was. And this is what I love philosophy all about. This is what philosophy is all about. But we have access to his tactics, and it's very important to see that these are two different things. And we're forced, again, as usual, we don't have access to reality. We have access to descriptions of reality. And the description we have access to is the tactics. And we have to sort of group together with all the different types of angles of knowledge that we can come up with the best possible description story of what he was thinking. What was he thinking? I have no access to what he was thinking, but I can imagine that what we're thinking about what he was thinking was probably pretty close. He wanted to communicate these causes. He says it outright, and yet he doesn't list them out. He tells the story and he compares things like, what's he going on? So again, I have to put all this together. I believe it's probably mostly true. And the beautiful thing about mostly true is then that becomes universal for our time. You know, we get into the strategy of Donald Trump or the strategy of Putin or the strategy of anybody is only going to be able to be seen by their tactics. And in neuroscience, this is often referred to in Freud as the conscious and the subconscious from an internal point of view. But from an external point of view, I don't have access to other people's consciousness. I only have access to their descriptions of their own consciousness, whether it be facial descriptions as like, I see Rick nodding up and down. He's communicating his tactics, but I have no idea what's going on in his brain. He could be like, this is a delicious sandwich I'm looking at, right? You know, so, or he's like, your beard is ugly, but I'm going to nod anyways. I don't know. I can make up all these stories, but I really want to match the story I make to the evidence presented for me. And this is, again, going back to marrying, I feel like really intelligent people, or intelligence in general is about decision-making, and decision-making is about having this strange simultaneity of objects, specificity, and then a framework, context, which is sensitivity. And you see good doctors and everybody's doing this, or a good storyteller is doing this. How many props is he telling? Are these the essential props that we need to focus on? And is the context for what it's doing making sense? In engineering or in neuroscience, we call this a signal to noise ratio. It's like what's happening. Imagining we're all I have to do a little thought experiment. I'm sure you all hated thought experiments. That was sarcasm. Imagine we're all at a restaurant and there's a lot of noise out there and you just want to hear what I'm saying, right? But if I were to tell you, you know, strangely, like, everybody look at the color of Rick's shirt, that's the signal now. And my voice is just noise. So we're very much trying to harmonize the signal to noise ratio. And this is what life's all about. We're telling stories and we want to hear other people's stories. And I love, if I could say anything about Aeschylus and Herodotus too, the window into the past, you know, same thing with the Bible, like me as Jewish being Torah, it's all a window into the past and it makes a heritage that you can connect the dots. And it really, really, what I hate about, I don't like to use that word very much, so I don't hate it, but there are aspects of modern thinking, specifically, we would call it postmodernism in philosophy, that's just all about deconstructing things. Well, you're not building anything. We need to build things. Now, I get it. You need to deconstruct things to some degree in order to build new things. But you go down that rabbit hole too far, you don't even know what you're doing anymore, right? So looking back at these writings, at these stories, informs us so much into the nature of what we are now, right? It tells me who I am. I feel very connected to these stories, even though I have to imagine Peloponnesian Wars. I don't know anything about this, but I can imagine it, and there's a richness and a complexity, and I feel connected to it. And this is where the meaning comes in. Now I can use this meaning in my own life. I can apply it. And I think the last thing I'll end with is we live in a very childish society in the sense that a child, as differentiated by an adult can learn an idea or take an object, which is different necessarily than an idea. An idea is more like the story. And you can see the objects and the sets in that idea. And an adult applies the idea to his or her own needs. But a child has the idea apply its force to him or her, right? It's more like, are you using your phone or is your phone using you? You know? And this is where in a society, I think it's pretty obvious most of the objects we have in our life are using us so that whoever's making those things can make more of those things. And we're not really talking about whether the inherent value of those things in my story. You know, a good frame of this that I'll end with is in medicine, companies that make pills to provide medicine for people, the measure of success for them is just the number of pills they sell. They don't look at how many human beings they're helping. They're like, oh, we assume if we're selling more pills, then we're helping people. Thanks, you oxycodone and all the horrible, crisis we have of the opioid crisis because they sold too many pills. Their measure of success was selling as many pills as they could. That's a really specificity model of just sell the pills. And there's no sensitivity there. We're not seeing, so I love these stories because they help us really reframe the balance between specificity and sensitivity, strategy and tactics. I'll go off. That's good.
Thank you, Ari. Very entertaining and thought-provoking, and I'm glad you're enjoying these seminars. It is in fact a major reason why we're all doing this, right? Because this is our jam. There's so many different ways we could go with what you gave us. You've touched on so many interesting things. You've sort of woven it all together into a whole. So I'm just going to let it stand, and it's recorded, so we'll be able to come back to it. And thank you for it. So I'm going to take us back to the text, which is what I usually do after we've had a kind of a big digression. Whether it was me or somebody else, I like to loop back to Kenneth's words, because he's talking about the same stuff and we're talking about it too. We're on the same track. So that opening sentence with its two parts is talking about this problem that there is a fragility to any form of government that is being run by the aristoi, that is being run for the good of the whole as well as the individuals, that is leading in a healthy direction. And the fragility is not everybody's competent to govern such a society. Some of the people who aren't competent to govern it, just need to learn more, and then they'll grow into that competence. But other people are, by their character, unable to be competent to do it because their character militates against taking care of the whole. That all that they can see is opportunities for self-pleasuring or for predation. And those people will always be resenting not being in charge, and they'll always be searching for a way to upend the society. Last week, we did the first paragraph of this section. We talked a little bit about the sophists. And of course, part of what the sophists were offering around the time of Socrates and Plato and the Peloponnesian War, part of what they were offering was, previously rhetoric was primarily the domain of the aristoi, the people who were focused on good government. They studied how to use language in persuasive ways so that they could persuade people to do the right thing rather than having to force them to do the right thing. And the art of persuasion was central to the way that Athens was governed. And even Sparta, the upper class of Sparta, the way that it governed itself was primarily not by killing each other, but through persuasion. They would refer back to their wisdom literature and say, how does that apply to the current situation? Like Ari was saying, what's the overall story that we can make of this that's persuasive, that leads us to agree that our polis should take the following action. And the problem is that the sophists went into business teaching people who are not aristoi how to simulate eristic rhetorical argument. So they learned the objects that you have to deploy to convince somebody of something without learning any of the principles that should guide whether or not you should be trying to convince somebody of something. So these powerful tools of rhetoric and persuasion got put into the hands of people who are predators and con artists. And that went hand in hand with the Piraeus of Athens becoming the largest voting bloc and pulling Athens into the war. It wasn't just that they outvoted them, but that they were able to confuse and sometimes persuade even the aristoi, where it became divided amongst themselves through the confusion engendered by the use of rhetoric to mislead rather than to lead. And the way that you can tell the differences is if you were omniscient, which we're not, but if you were omniscient, what you would see is that an aristos deploys rhetoric to try to persuade people to what they genuinely truly believe, right? They're trying to be more honest than honest. They're trying to truly put themselves out there and say, look, these are the issues that are actually at stake here, and we need to focus on these things. Whereas a sophist, a banausos who's wielding sophistic rhetoric, what he's doing is he's thinking one set of things, which is, I'm going to be so rich if I can talk Athens into attacking Megara And then from there, we can go attack Syracuse. And then from there, we'll be able to attack Carthage. And then we'll rule the Mediterranean. We'll be the biggest trade empire in history. And I'll be so rich. But none of those words come out of their mouth. Because they know that if they just say that, the Aristoi will be like, that's a terrible idea. And you should definitely not be in charge of anything. You're as rich as you should be. You're already a menace. Let's just stop right here. So instead, they're saying pretty words and appealing to what this, and this is where Kenneth makes his distinction between principles and ideals. You know, they sound like they're being guided by principles, but actually it's empty ideals. And the way you can tell is they don't actually care about any of the things they're saying. They're only saying those things because they've studied you and figured out what your buttons are. And they know that if they say the following things in the following way, they can push your buttons and get you confused or to agree with them, even though they don't actually want any of that. They want war of conquest and to become, kings of the world. So there is this dishonesty and hypocrisy that's built into sophistry and rhetoric when it is co-opted by sophistry rather than being used for philosophical purposes. And this is what we're concerned about here. For a committed Banausos, so Banausos being the character type that's attached to pragmatic concerns like how do I get more money, how do I outvote you, how do I get a bigger house than you, how do I get into your savings account and put that in my savings account. But this kind of dog eat dog zero sum thinking that Banausoi engage in is not principle driven. There's no principles. But if you asked a Banausos and you could get him to be honest about what he considers his principles, he would think those things are principles because he lives in a kind of flatland in which there is no third dimension. So just like the residents of flatland, they understand a circle, but they don't understand a sphere. And when a sphere passes through the plane of their flatland, they think a circle comes out of nowhere and grows, and then it shrinks, and then it disappears, and it just happens for no reason. And they think that's the truth of what happened because they can't imagine the third dimension. In the same way, the Banausos can't imagine real principles. And so they translate their own egocentric goals, their pragmatic, egocentric, systematizing, predatory goals. They translate that onto the terminology of principles. They say, well, I have principles. I'm a pragmatic man. And, I believe in being pragmatic. I don't like wasting time with all this falderall, navel gazing nonsense that those crazy philosophers do. And it's something I meant to say last week. It's like, this is why you see in, I think it's Cicero who wrote the book on the virtues, why he opens his book by apologizing for writing a book on the virtues. Because I know it's wrong. It's so terribly, he's a Roman, it's so terribly wrong to talk about things that are not immediately practically useful. But I promise you, he says, I promise you that discussing the virtues bears pragmatic, tangible, feel it in your pocketbook results. He's trying to motivate the mafiosa style government of the Roman Empire to pay attention to virtues by trying to translate virtues into something that you can see on a spreadsheet. Because he knows if he doesn't do that, he's going to get in trouble. The Roman Empire at this point has become so barbaric that you're not allowed to talk about things that don't immediately explain how the mafia boss is going to get richer. It's the only thing he wants to hear. How are you going to improve my bottom line? That was the government, right, as he understood it. And what a difference that is from Plato in the Republic, or Socrates at the assembly of Athens debating what they should do as a polis, where they're appealing to virtues like for real. They're really applying to principles and virtues and what should the structure of this decision be that we need to make together? How do we see past merely barbaric pragmatic concerns of the moment to the longer term consequences of what we're doing and whether it's the right choice? It's a huge fall from the Athens before Solon to the Athens dominated by the Piraeus during the Peloponnesian War, and then another huge fall from there all the way down to the rule by mafiosi of the Roman Empire. So Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, you have mentioned in the past that the Romans were curious about the gods of other people. Is there something we're missing? I don't know if we really see anything like this in the modern world. Well, I give the example of Alexander. Oh, there's this guy called Diogenes. What is he? Oh, he's this homeless guy living in a rubbish heap. Oh, that sounds fascinating. He's got a few things to say. Oh, Alexander will go and see this homeless guy living in a rubbish heap because he's reputedly got some good lines. Where do we see that today? Who do we see doing that? Certainly not the guys at the top. I was arguing with one guy some couple of months ago. And I said, well, what's the problem? He dislike Putin. And he said, well, I said, what's the problem with Putin? He said, he's against democracy. Did you know democracy is a special sauce? You can just spread it anywhere and everything will come up shiny and new. This is what most people think. So the question here is, where is this going? Because it's sort of like the present thing with Western civilization is we've got the answers. We only need to hammer everybody with our answers and the world's going to come up. Fantastic. Oh, I know a few million people will be killed in the process, but when we get to our utopia, it will be worth it. This is in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where the computers tell them, well, I've given you the answer. Maybe the problem is your questions. And yes, we see, well, I keep on hearing about these people talking about critical thinking. And all I can see is download our truth. Don't question it, just download it into your brain. I'll give the late medieval Catholic Church more credit in this regard. Even they would entertain the questions a bit better than what's going on now. And that's it. We're living in a culture which in that regard is worse than the Romans, that is so satisfied with its rigid ideas, doesn't want to question them. You question the ideas, you're a troublemaker. And as regards the ego, what you see going on in a lot of people's lives, like you'll have the housewife who goes out and gets a job in a company, and maybe she wears some nice clothes and gets on a board meeting. Her ego suddenly explodes. She's gone from being a housewife, that drudgery, it's not really me, and then suddenly, oh, I'm this big person because I'm sitting in a board meeting wearing nice clothes. I'm going places. The ego explodes and she's tossing out what were her responsibilities. This is a very modern phenomenon. You see it everywhere. You run into people who would toss Diogenes out the front door for sure. Hey, look at me. I've got my nice clothes on. I'm adopting all the right airs. And I know because the Titanic, I'm on the Titanic, I've got a good seat. What can go wrong? I'm on this prestigious ship. I'm on, got the best berth. I'm at the top, man. It can only get better. So this is a question for the egotists, that they're pursuing the path and they're so satisfied with it. They think they don't see any pitfalls. And that's the question. We're living in a culture which will not deal with things outside its rigid position. It's like that UKIP guy in Britain when he said that, well, we were provoking the Russians, and they all jump on him, screaming, beating his head. Yeah, how dare you say that? Like, aren't we allowed to question things anymore? No. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And your point about Diogenes is fantastic. You know, I'm Alexander, right? He's not just the head of some polis. He's like, master of the entire Hellenistic empire. It's like at that time, it was the largest empire anybody ever seen. It dwarfed the Persian Empire. And yet he goes to visit a homeless guy because he heard the guy might be wise. So, you ask, would that happen today? And I'm fairly confident saying that no US president has ever gone under a bridge and spent time with people who are genuinely homeless. They will show up to disaster areas, right, where people who were not homeless are now displaced, and it's a great tragedy, right? But they won't go to people who there's been no hurricane, there's been no earthquake. These people just don't have homes, and they've been living for years, in an encampment in the forest. No president would ever do that. And part of the way you know that is it was only one of the most recent 3 presidents was the first president in U.S. history to actually personally go onto an Indian reservation and meet with tribal elders. In the past, they either said, if you want to meet with us, you come to us, or they sent their captains and generals and machine guns to the reservation. But they themselves never went because, of course, well, you got to ask, whose land are we on? How could you not meet with them once in 200 years? You really had nothing to say? You couldn't bother to show a modicum of even gratitude? So if they're not going to meet with those guys who they're bound to by treaties which have the force of international law, they're certainly not going to waste their time going to see people under a bridge, not even if it's Diogenes, not even if it were Jesus himself, would they go under the bridge to talk to who it is, because these guys are so obsessed with image and ego, and how will this be seen by voters? Will this improve my standing in the polls or make it worse? And this is what rules them: the ideologies and the systems of their society, and not any genuine concern for wisdom. So Stephen, it's a brilliant example. Diogenes and Alexander, that's a great story. I love that one. Let's do the next sentence. I'm just going to pull it out for people out of the paragraph. And there's a few things we'll pull out of this for people who are new to the call as well. Douloi are slaves in such ways and for such reasons as militate against their fully grasping why they're slaves. That is, what prerequisites of free citizenry and philosophical individuality they lack by nature. So this is where it's really helpful to understand that the Greeks had multiple words for slave. And the word for people who are definitely in the caste of slaves, and just those people, they used other words for. Like people who had been captured in war and enslaved, were I can't, anthropodes, I think was the term, human-footed beasts of burden, and it was used, sometimes in a tragic way, also to refer to free people who were on the road from one polis to another who got captured by bandits and made into slaves, who there's nothing about them slavish per se, other than just their misfortune. They just happen to have been grabbed and enslaved. That's one set of terms. But the term doulos is used, or in here, the plural douloi is used in a different way. And it does they sometimes use it to refer to people who are in the caste or class of slaves, but they more frequently and generally use it for people who have the mindset of slaves, regardless of whether they're free or not, regardless of whether they have the franchise or not. Who has a slavish character? And it's not the only form of slavish character. Who specifically has that form of slavish character that's governed by their parochial experiences and their appetites and memories, in which what they want is their God, and what they have personally experienced is their God, and they're not willing to consider a larger world. They want to reduce the entire cosmos to their one single lifetime of experience and nothing more. Those are douloi to the Greeks, according to the book that I was reading about images of the slave. a couple months ago. It's quite good, well worth chasing down. So when he says doulos are slaves in such ways and for such reasons, he means they're doulos are people who have a slavish character. So like vast numbers of free people in the modern world are douloi, right? We read about them every day in the newspapers, right? Darwin Awards are given to people who are obviously douloi, and we all like to share stories about, you will not believe what this one guy at the store did, or what this one woman in traffic did. And we see people who are 100% governed by their emotions and their appetites and their experiences. We see them all the time. We know they exist. We just don't have a word for them the way that the Greeks did. The Greeks, we might insult them. We might call them a jerk or an asshole or something, but that's not a word that specifically means people with a slavish character. Our term character doesn't even have the meaning that it did to the Greeks. Their word ethos really did refer to the constitution of your psyche. What is the systematic structure of your psyche such that it produces your behavior in life and makes you think the things you do and makes you do the things you do. Our word character is way fuzzier and vaguer than that. It doesn't mean anything like that. So not only don't we have the word doulos, we don't even have the word ethos, into which doulos plugs as an example, right? We got, douloi and banausoi and aristoi are three different types of ethoi. We're missing all four of these terms. We're as Kenneth says, on the great odyssey of life, most lives are still stuck on the beach trying to get the boat off the rocks and into the water. It's like we aren't even in this conversation. The Greeks are having all these conversations about how do you organize a just society so that you're not abusing your douloi, you're not abusing your banausoi, you're not suppressing your aristoi, and you're creating a society in which everybody can fully express their character in the healthiest possible ways, and in which you recognize growth and change. That someone who becomes an aristos starts out with a more rudimentary character than that. They have to go through stages of development psychologically at a level of character, just like we do physically. So just like we wouldn't expect, a toddler to vote, or an infant to drink alcohol, except in some cultures. We reserve some things for adulthood, and they do the same at the political level, and they think that that's the fair, natural, reasonable thing to do. Aristotle also talks straight out about the problem of mismatches between the class structure and the character structure. You go around enslaving people who have the character of an aristos, you're committing a crime against humanity and a crime against nature, and it's every bit as bad if you elect to a position of power someone who's a con man or a predator. That person has no business being in charge of the government. They aren't even really in charge of themselves, right? Their appetites rule them. So, they're saying you have to make these difficult judgments. You have to constantly be studying each other and yourselves and trying to find a way to organize your society that fits the actual nature of people as we encounter them in real life. Not.
I have to ask you a question. I'm sorry. What culture allows infants to drink alcohol? You just said some cultures.
So Beverly's grandparents, talked about how in the old country, in Ireland, they used to put a little, whiskey or, on the tongues of infants to give them some alcohol to try to help them sleep or calm down.
You're kidding me. Oh my God.
And they give them put alcohol in the bottle and help them calm down.
I want to answer this question.
For their gums when they're teething.
Right.
Yeah, no, but in modern Jewish and forever, the circumcision for the 8-year-old boy, when they're getting that, it's very painful. You give a cloth dipped in some wine and you put that in their mouth. And that's been going on for thousands of years.
Grandparents did it too. I'm from the Italian culture, so.
Yeah.
So it's probably more universal than we think.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, the rules about age and alcohol are that businesses can't sell alcohol to minors. But at least in the United States, the law doesn't say anything about what your parents can give to minors. I mean, they can, and what everybody just said is part of the reason why. So this is what we're talking about is the Greeks are wrestling with, or they may not be succeeding, right? And there's plenty of injustice in the Greek world. We could talk about that for 100 sessions too. But the Greeks are trying to grapple with the problem of, if people are different from each other, if we're not all free, if we're not all wise, if we're not all able to temper our appetites, if we're not all able to question our ideologies, if we're at different stages of development, how do you organize a just society for people, right? So that people can be as free as they're able to be without hurting themselves or others, and giving them opportunities to grow and develop further. How do you do that? And in the modern world, we don't do that at all. We just declare by fiat, everybody's wise and free, and the end. And then we just lay a couple of lines in the sand around age, and we call it quits. And everybody can see that it's nonsense, right? I mean, if we can step out of our modernist ideology long enough to look around, we see all kinds of supposed adults who wreck their lives left and right. And we probably are related to a number of people who wreck their lives left and right. And some of us in our own lives have wrecked parts of our lives, right? I mean, we've all experienced this way in which mismatches between power and responsibility on the one hand and capability on the other, it causes terrible problems. It causes terrible problems. I remember the film Catch Me If You Can. Did you guys ever see Catch Me If You Can? About one of the best con artists of all time.
With Leonardo DiCaprio? Yeah.
Yes. And there he is, passing as just one profession after another and fitting in so well that not only is he passing, but people are starting to think he's really good at it. It's like, wow, this is the best doctor ever. He's so interested in my health. And, it's really easy in the modern world. Despite all the things we do to try to stop it, it's really easy in the modern world to mismatch capabilities with powers and authority. And the clearest example of that is the US presidency, where the Constitution says what? You have to be a certain age, not convicted of a felony yet. That's it. It could be your desire to destroy the world, and that's fine. You could be president. Why not? It's not, we really don't care who's president. And we're like the opposite of the Greeks in this regard. We have no regard whatsoever for the actual people who exist. We just have this formal system of, jump through these hoops and you're in. Voila, congratulations. And we do the opposite thing, with our welfare system. You could have somebody who's starving to death and in desperate need of help, and yet they have to jump through so many hoops that they'll die long before they get through them, just to get, a loaf of bread and a place to sleep the night. I had to rescue my brother 4 or 5 years ago when, it was taking too long to find shelter in Seattle because there were too many hoops to jump through. He'd lost his home and winter was setting in. It was going to freeze. My brother was going to die, in a park in Seattle. And, we had to mobilize all our resources to try to get him someplace to stay, because our systems for distinguishing who's ripping off the system versus who's really in trouble are so bad that they aren't able to match the capabilities of the society with the actual needs of the people who are in it. They can't distinguish a con artist from somebody in need. They look the same to the way that we govern Seattle and homelessness. So this is what he's talking about here. Doulos are slaves in such ways and for such reasons as to militate against their fully grasping why they're slaves. Why can't they fully grasp why they're slaves? Because all they see are their appetites and their emotions and their experiences and memories. If it hasn't happened to them, and if they didn't have the right aha experiences, it doesn't exist at all. Right? It's like that whole part of life is just it's blotted out. It's a gap in reality. And that gap is infinite in size, because the cosmos, compared to a human life and human experience, is infinite in size. So the vast majority of the universe, and also the vast majority of what's going on right around them, is completely invisible to them. And they're just making decisions based on, I like this and I don't like that, and that makes me angry. And that's it. That's a doulos. And you can't have people that, nothing that comes, no decision making that comes out of somebody who thinks that way should be called governance. You shouldn't say, well, we elected him and he's president, so therefore it's governance. That's the Greeks would say that's insane. You're not dealing with the concrete, tangible reality of the person in front of you and what they're failing to do. Right? What you're doing is you're saying, well, I have a formal system and it defines who's president. And if it defines them as president, then ipso facto they are, even if no sane society would ever call that person a president. We are trapped by our formalisms and our formal thinking, which is what Kenneth doesn't talk about here. He's talking about douloi. But if he were going to talk about banausoi in the next sentence, he'd say that the problem with banausoi is they're so blinded by their systems of categorizing and making choices that they aren't actually aware and awake and thinking at all. They're like, well, he won the election, so therefore he's the judge. Congratulations, he's now a judge. Even if any sane society would say that man will never be a judge. No matter what powers you give him, he's incompetent to judge. Judging is not among his gifts. He's never going to be able to do it. He may fake it and do something else while sitting in the robes behind the bench, but it's never going to be judging. So what this sentence is saying is that this is the problem, is that, he says in the first sentence that there is this problem of resentment, that the people in Athens who are not participating in the government resent the people who are, because they don't see why they shouldn't be allowed to indulge their appetites more fully by having their hands on the wheel of state. They think that's how things should run. They imagine that that's what the people in charge are doing because nobody could possibly be better than themselves. Their ego is so big, it doesn't allow for the possibility of them imagining that there are different kinds of people who relate to the world differently than they do. So they don't see why anybody else should be governing if they're not governing. And the nature of that blind spot is it doesn't just happen to be something they overlook. It's the very structure of their character that makes those parts of life invisible so they can't be seen by them. That's what it is to be a doulos. And the banausos is the intellectual systematizing version of that. Rather than being your immediate emotions and your overt appetites, it's, well, my rules and laws tell me the following. I subscribe to the following ideology, and the ideology tells me these things are right and these things are wrong. So I'm always going to punish the wrong things and reward the right things. Even if that has nothing to do with what's actually going on in front of me, my ideology will think for me, and I'll just sleepwalk my way through life, as a puppet of my ideology. All right, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Hey, I really wanted to, Rick, if you don't mind, you're going to have to answer some questions because I'm not good with the language. I'm learning these categories of slaves, I think they are, the douloi, and then the other one, the people who do these categories. I wanted to frame them in terms of my favorite philosopher. This is Simone de Beauvoir, and she is my favorite because she's the only philosopher that I know that makes Nietzsche look like a complete dummy. She just is able to rip his arguments to shreds, and you think he's so great, but it's just unbelievable. So anyways, she and he basically agree with this idea of the douloi, of a slave, and this is sort of couched in the slave morality versus master morality to some degree. This is someone who really doesn't know what they're doing. So the slave morality, he talks in this idea that these people that we all are to begin with as adults, or people once we've entered the adult world, is called a camel, and you're just here to carry stuff. You don't think, you don't do. And that's what we are, most of actually us are in now. We're so burdened with busy schedules. We don't have the luxury to talk philosophy like you and I, all of us are. We should feel very privileged. And the key is we understand that privilege is a special thing to hopefully help and benefit others, which is actually we're going to get with Simone de Beauvoir. She thinks this is the purpose of power, is to will the power of others. Which is a weird paradox in itself. And it makes sense because, like, in an environment, if you want to be safe, well, you want to make sure everybody's safe so that you're safe. And really, we have to start with the beginning, which is the camel, which is we're all just beasts of burden having to do stuff. And a person is like, there's a lot of safety in that. There's actually a lot of goodness in that. You're a part of the herd. And that means the predators are going to come. They're not going to pick you off. So he says the next thing you need to do if you want to enter in a higher stage of morality is actually to recognize how foolish a lot of the rules you are using. And he calls this the child. And I think these are the douloi. I think the child is the douloi. The child is free to do whatever he wants. He doesn't have to worry about all these stupid rules. He doesn't have to be part of the herd, right? But the child obviously just gets picked off by the wolf as soon as he leaves the herd. So this really isn't going to do very much, but it's the beginning of reason, I think he calls it, the beginning of the will to power. And what happens next is once you are a child, you start learning, that maybe it's unsafe to leave the herd to some degree. And the idea is he calls the next type of person, which I think of these categories, people, is, what did Nietzsche shred? We're about to find out. Nietzsche didn't shred. It's that Simone de Beauvoir shreds Nietzsche. And we're going to explain, because Nietzsche ends up at this next stage. He actually calls the end point of the Übermensch is the adventurer. The adventurer is the guy who is no longer the child. He is able to, almost like a video game character, you may have played these type of video games, where you just start off and you can do whatever you want. You can break the rules, and all you care about as the adventurer are the outcomes. This is very Machiavellian. You're just looking at the outcomes, and you can choose any process you want. All these rules, all those moralities are just for weak people who are stuck as being camels, and they're really a system to trap people in this herd. And to some degree, that's right, and to some degree, that's also wrong, because we need the everything is a dual-edged sword. The camels are protected by the rules as much as they are burdened by them or limited by them. But he says, honestly, like, he couches really this is religion or Christianity. He doesn't really talk about, I don't think he talks about Islam or Judaism or even any of the Asian cultures that we might call religions. He doesn't really discuss this. I think he's pretty much arguing specifically against Christianity and the Catholic Church and how they're making a bunch of camels. And they're like, don't think about things. Don't think about, just follow whatever we tell you, right? Just eat what you're told to eat and do what you're told to do. And this is what God wants. And he's like, well, maybe I could figure out what God wants for myself, kind of thing. If there is a God, except we killed him, and this idea, well, now that I killed God, I can be the adventurer and do whatever I want. I break through the rules. He puts out this Übermensch is going to be one's going to surpass the rules and really create his own rules for what he wants. And this is kind of where he ends, which is so weirdly childish. If you apply this into a system of scale, like universality, like the Kant's idea of like, well, how does this apply to if everybody were to be the adventurer, what do you have? You have a bunch of thugs and bandits and people just killing each other. You don't have any society, you have anarchy. This is not what we want. Again, because you're just wielding the power of yourself. And this is the type of government that you're sort of looking at, that barbaric mafiosa style. I love that language, that storytelling of mafioso. We all have the story of mafioso. That's very much our current government, which is, what have you done for me lately? How is this going to improve my pocketbook? And it's very much, there's no room for virtue. Right. And so, again, if I were to talk to them, I'd have to apologize, because like, this is doesn't seem practical. But the idea is we all want better outcomes. So I want to show you a way that gets better outcomes. But I still have to couch it in terms of outcomes. Right. I can't just be like, what's best? I can't even, we don't have time or attention. All the ADHD society, we don't have the ability, the discomfort to just stay with ideas, like question whether we agitated Russia, right? Did we agitate Russia? Did we cut them off from the internet or all these economic things that make them desperate? Maybe. Is that going to be, if you look at it in a world like, well, what's the natural response to someone who's backed into a corner? Well, this is exactly what a terrified animal does. They become desperate and they become vicious. And to be honest, I don't blame them. This makes sense in terms of their environment. But we don't want to see our role in the environment. We're not even able to. And this is the nature of the adventurer. The adventurer is so sick of rules. He sees anything in the environment as a rule, as something to cut down. And in a purely toxic place, maybe you have to burn it down. But again, that's not really, I don't agree with that. I won't say that. I don't even say that. You don't burn anything down, because that just creates a lot more problems. We have to transform. In other words, we're not going to kill the moth. We're going to transform the moth, which is a slug-eating thing, which we are, into a beautiful butterfly. That's what nature's all about. It's all about transformation. And enter Simone de Beauvoir. She's so amazing. She characterizes exactly what I said in a lot of ways, pointing out that, okay, someone who just wills the power of themselves is a horrible person. This is a selfish narcissist. And this is exactly like, I get it, in capitalism, these outcomes work nicely to some degree, but they're going to lead us to where you have a society of pure winners and losers, and winners do whatever they can, not whatever they should, to win. And therefore, winning isn't even real, because they're not playing by rules. They're just taking and stealing, and like, this is horrible. Right. So what does Simone de Beauvoir say? The next level, all these other three things, even the adventurer, I believe she doesn't say this outright, but I believe if we were to compare her, to have her have a conversation with the Greeks, she would be open to say that even the adventurer, not only the child and not only the camel, are all forms of slaves. They all can't see what they're doing. And a slave is characterized, again, actually, I think the modern language we have for these type of things, like the douloi and who's the other guy, the categories guy?
The Banausoi.
The Banausoi, thank you. Those guys are actually much closer to our mythology of zombies and androids. A zombie just eats, doesn't do anything. At least an android's a part of a system, but he just does what he's told, right? And to some degree, we have all this stories and mythology around zombies and androids and how they're bringing the apocalypse. And it's like, those are, to some degree, a leader of the androids is probably an adventurer. And the zombie is probably just the camel, and who's a slave to their whatever internal things they need to do. But she brings out this person. I don't think we have a name for it. I actually don't know a term, but we should have one for the true adult, or the individual who's not an individual, who's a member, is what a better I'd say, not an individual, but a member of a society, is that he or she who wills the power of others. And this is the nature of cooperation in any cooperative thing. Anything that you want to be successful, if you rally the troops, you bring people together to do great things. And so a real leader or a real member is all about making sure if other people are stronger, if everybody is stronger, I'm stronger. And you know what? At the end of the day, I'm selfish. I only care about me. I want to be stronger. But the beautiful idea of being selfish in this relationship is I am not just this little body in my little head. I am all of society. I'm everybody. And so if I see my fellow get hurt, it's like my finger's getting hurt. And I'm like, oh, well, I want to fix my finger. Well, it's a part of me. And this is the nature of self, where we can really grow and transform, where we look at others and scale. And again, humans are not built for this way. I don't know how we're going to transform or what ideas we need to do this, but it's again where Stalin, or I forget the guy he actually relies on for this beautiful idea of the limits of humanity, is one death is a tragedy. 1,000,000 deaths is the statistic. And right now, we don't have any tragedies. We just have statistics because it's on a scale we can't relate to. You know, it's like if we're on the moon and there's a bunch of ants down there, we have no connection to any of this. And so it is very naturally a very hard problem in a universal sense to will the power of others. And so Simone de Beauvoir is very nice, and I agree with this too, that on a small scale, willing the power of others is all about loving your fellow. You know, this is almost like Jesus, or before Jesus, it was Hillel in who says, love your fellow like yourself. And what this really means is transforming the idea of your fellow and transforming the idea of yourself. And it also transforms the idea of love itself. And this is a very difficult concept for anybody in the modern day who wants to relate to other people. But the natural starting place for this, that Simone de Beauvoir definitely talks about, is your family, the people you know, anybody and to some degree, if you're powerful enough, the homeless guy in the street, pull over and just have a conversation with him. Say, hey, buddy, have you talked to anybody today? That's probably his greatest source of suffering, that he doesn't talk to anybody. Like in the Jewish faith, the point of charity is not just to give someone money. It's a higher level to give some guy a conversation and give him money than to just give him money. And this seems obvious because we care about the dignity of what's going on here. You don't just give them money so they can live. Well, what's living without dignity? So usually dignity is conversations or relationships or whatever. And this is where my heart really goes out to homeless people. And I try, and occasionally if I see them around, to just talk to them like they're regular people. Treat them like they're a regular person. And you know what? They usually come away very, very much happier. And it's a hard thing to do because it challenges my sense of self, which is terrifying, which is ultimately we're all afraid of death. And there's an idea that I could become a homeless person, and that's a form of death. And I don't want to think about that at all. I don't want to think that I could be a homeless person one day. That would be horrible. Well, I can't even stay with the thought of being horrified by it. And this is their reality, right? So this is how far we are from our fellow. And this is what Simone de Beauvoir really encapsulates. I think you can apply this everywhere in what we're talking about, in what is going on. It's all about willing the power of others. So the question that's really also impossible to answer is, well, how do we do that? That requires a context, a framework, all these complicated things. I hear that. But if we can stay focused on the willing the power of others and not get distracted, I feel very confident that if you could imagine, like I had a magic superpower I could put into the minds of every person in all of the United States, the primary thought that they had was will the power of others, will the power of others, will the power of others. And that's just a script that keeps running. They would put a lot of attention to everything they do now in terms of that. and our society would get so much better, so much faster. But again, I don't have that superpower. I would love to have that superpower, but I love, again, this is where I mean, I'm clearly heavily biased to Simone de Beauvoir. I'm just madly in love with her. And I wish like I could have met her and had conversations with, because her mind, the way, again, the way that Nietzsche is, I hate to say, he's such a chauvinist. He's such a classic male aggressor who can't see his own childishness. And if you look at his own life, he really struggled with interpersonal relationships. He was very depressed. That meant he was very isolated, which means he can't see his own blind spots. As opposed to Simone de Beauvoir, if I understood her right, she lived a much more full and healthy life, which meant she was able to understand these things more like an adult. And I'm not even trying to criticize Nietzsche. I'm just pointing out his limitations. This is who he was, and then he did the best he could. And he pointed out that, I'm making mistakes. I'm probably going to do this. My ideas, with the death of God are going to kill a bunch of stuff. And this is where, a modern nationalism and statehood and all these horrible things rely on his will to power, which is, again, just a bastardized version of taking the props out of the story and creating your own story. But I think you're not able to do that with props. And this we were talking about this, just make categories or just look at a bottom line. Again, if you're looking at people and how those people are going to improve, it really washes away anything about the bottom line that doesn't relate to those people, right? And so therefore you make a nice tension between willing the power of others and whatever statistical thing you're trying to imagine that's a good measure of quality or success, we'll marry it to what's going on with the people. And this is where we talked about in last week or another week about the consent of the governed, right? This is the consent of the governed is a nice translation in a macro sense of willing the power of others. And I don't think I would be able to see all the things that I just described to you right now without Aeschylus. I would be blind. I would probably be maybe the child or the adventurer, and I wouldn't be able to see past my own cutting down things around me for myself, as opposed to what am I creating for others. And I think that's a good place to end. I don't know if there's a word that the Greeks had, but it'd be great if we could answer it. What was the word for this person that wills the power of others?
Thank you, Ari. Yeah, that's fascinating. I'd love to, if you can remember, if you can come up with a title of work in which Simone de Beauvoir specifically talked about, these different character types.
Oh, definitely. I'll go over that. I have it on my sources, but I have all. Yeah, I can look it up pretty easy.
Yeah, that'd be great.
May I just very, very quick reaction to what Ari said, please? Just very quick.
Okay.
Ari, you said some very interesting things. It said very interesting things, but there's one thing that you said I just cannot accept or even what's the word? Is that you don't blame Russia for what they did. It's like, oh my God, please don't say that.
No. That was again taken out of context. I fully think that they're invaders and they're horrible, but it's more like it's more like the idea that they don't have decision making outside of all humans are very limited in their decision making, and so what they're doing is very natural, but evil is very natural too. So it's like I'm not divorcing that they're not responsible. What they're doing is horrible, but again, it feels justified, very similar to a lot of other horrible things people do, right? So this is more comparing them to other people and saying that like, oh, they're doing horrible things, but it's probably not that much better than a lot of other horrible things. So, but I agree 100%. What they are doing is absolutely unacceptable, and it's exactly what they're doing, what we want to get away from. I hope that is okay to say it like that. I definitely, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, also, the way it came out, I said, what? I mean, I was horrified, actually.
Yeah, please. This is how I learn, is by making mistakes. So, it was fantastic.
That's how we all learn. That's what Aeschylus says. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about a divergence that, in a sense, doesn't satisfy me in one sense, but emerge in a different way. Well, I'll begin by saying, I do have a problem with the word slavery. That's probably because of my modernist thinking. like oppressions of others. So I'll have to get deeper in how the Greeks define slave in different categories. But my thought is, if it's one thing that Socrates taught us, that he didn't know. He was wise enough to know he didn't know. Okay. Which means he's wise enough to know that he has limitations as a human being in terms of knowledge. And so my first thought is that, well, then you're categorizing this limited knowledge to somebody who doesn't even know that he doesn't know. Then you're talking about the relationship between not the smart guy versus the dumb guy, but you're talking about dumb and dumber. And I wonder whether that is actually a good category, right? I'll choose the dumb rather than the dumber because none of us know. So that to me leads to, in a way, Plato, which sort of somehow hints that that Socrates does know in a deep way. And so therefore, in a sense, the divider line and the forms. And that was an attempt to exactly reach beyond wisdom to some kind of pure knowledge, a pure understanding of some sort. But I think that really goes back in a way to Socrates in a sense. There is a difference between wisdom and truth. Truth is what God knows, if there is a God. And wisdom is what human beings have sort of illustrated as a way to truth. But it is not true. So we're already living within the structure of dumb, but not dumber. Okay, so I'll accept that division to a certain degree. It seems to me what Plato is aiming at is he needed Augustine to rescue him, to give him the mind of God, in a sense. So I could see, I'm sure Plato would resist that, but I could see that it needed that pillar of some kind of absolute knowledge to, in a sense, give form, the truth of forms, rather than an aspiration of forms. So that actually, in a funny way, very comfortably leads it into the Middle Ages, right? Where, in a sense, there was a God, presumably, that knows it, not just be wise, but actually knows what is right, what is truth, and not just wisdom, which is limited understanding in a way. Okay, then I was thinking, well, that doesn't seem to work. So we, in a sense, fall back into a kind of wisdom, which I think is Kant, right? In other words, a kind of humanist limitation, understanding, accepting that in a sense. And so Kant builds a kind of universality, which is the opinions of the multitudes in relationship to the singularity of the individual. So you have a social structure. Okay, that's okay. That's accepting the limitations and doing the best you can with those limitations and whatever it is. So every time you're doing something, and that seems to lead to Simone de Beauvoir in some ways, that in a sense, your action has a relationship to others in a community, and it must be constructed in a way that harmonizes with the community as such. I kind of have a problem with this in this sense. Not that I don't believe in that. I remember, and I told this story before, about 4 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. I was going to go to a jazz concert, and before there was time, so I pop into, what is it, a burger place. It was Jack in the Box, just a quick meal. So I'm standing in line, waiting in line, and there appears to be a very poor person, probably homeless. He was standing next to me. She was counting change, and it seemed like there's very little. I said, what are you going to get? She said, well, I hope I have enough to get some chicken fingers. So I thought about that, and I felt a little guilty because I just happened to be standing next to her. So I said, how would you like if I bought you a hamburger? She just lit up and said, sure, that sounds great. So I'm thinking, well, I'm going to get a full meal. So I'm still feeling a little bit bad. I mean, not that bad, but I'm feeling a little bad. I'm sort of slighting her in the sense I'm going to have a full meal and she's going to have a hamburger. That's it. So I said, oh, I think I'm going to upgrade that to a full meal. So we both have a full meal. Okay, fine. She's like that. I thought my duty was done. Being very nice. But what I did was I bought a conversation with her. So I sat on the table and she's following me and sitting at the same table. And of course, we talked. And what's very interesting is she spent the whole time trying to convince me that she was not homeless. Now, I wasn't going to disc her by saying, oh, let's give that up. You at least appear to be homeless. Oh, I have a home in Ohio. I had to move here. I said, why aren't you staying in Ohio to fight for your home? She said, well, it got very complicated with a lawyer, so he's taking care of that. And I'm here, just waiting my time. I'm going to go back and be homeless. So that surprised me. But nonetheless, I tried to talk to her and say, give her some advice maybe of how she might behave in terms of at least trying to save her home. It was no avail. Finally, the meal ended. So that was kind of a relief for me because now I don't have to hassle with a homeless person that claims she's not homeless. Okay, that's fine. As I left, I remember very distinctly, and it shocked me. I was going to go to the restroom, before I go to the concert. And this lady sitting in the pathway happened to have a little girl by her. And she put up her hand like to block me, like, no, you're not getting near my child. So I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what's going on? I decided it just wasn't worth it. I was going to leave, okay? What I was shocked at is that a couple of things. I would have thought that people would like give me maybe a thumbs up, like, oh, like nice of you to do that. But I did not expect to be treated as if somehow I achieved some kind of cooties by helping somebody, at least neutral. And later on, I told this story and somebody says, well, the problem with you, Phil, is you violated the social norms. Okay? It's not that you didn't do the right thing. You violated the social norms. Because the people who are not yet homeless don't want this woman around. And you gave her permission to be around, reaffirm her permission to be around. And so how do you deal with a society in which you are trying to be communal in some sense, but there's a sort of antithesis against you being that way because there are people caught in situations, and in a way, I don't blame them. They don't want to be associated because they're practically homeless themselves, and they want to really distinguish that sharp line. And when you do that, you violated something. So that's what the community you're putting into is not just thinking about yourself in relationship with others, but there's a mixed message within the others that doesn't want you to do that whatsoever. It's like you have violated because there's layers of sort of like mores. And so which one should you violate and which one should you not violate? So it's a much more complicated structure than just say, oh, just be kind to others and everything will be nice. No, I was essentially scolded for doing what I appear to be right. Now, I don't want to sing the virtues of that because it just happened in the circumstance. But nonetheless, yeah, I have violated a rule that I did not know there was such a rule, but obviously it's a very, very real rule that, of the association you're with. So it's a much more complex, nuanced environment of a social structure than just do the right thing. Do the right thing is I should just snarl at this woman. Like, oh, you're gonna buy chicken fingers at good luck, lady. I mean, is that doing the right thing? I don't think so, but nonetheless, that seems to be a kind of message that I didn't get. But now I'm a little bit more aware of the complexities of maneuvering in a very complex society in which the rules are diverse and unclear, and depending where you are, it could be very, very different. That's it. So that's the modern manifestation of humanism, as well as the manifestation of the divine laws, in some sense. That's
Thank
it.
you, Phil. Thank you, Phil. That's a good example. Part of what we see and what Kenneth's alluding to in this text is this idea that, the douloi he's talking about, and this doesn't just apply to them, but to the Banausoi as well, and frankly, all of us to some extent. The reason that they want to be in charge, even though they're incompetent to be in charge, is that they don't know who they are. They think they're somebody other than who they are. They think they're somebody who has powers that they don't have. Like that bragging teenager who says, I could win that music contest if I wanted to. I could win that spelling bee if I wanted to. I'm stronger than Arnold Schwarzenegger. Can't stop describing the person he imagines himself to be or wishes that he were, who's aspirational for him, as though that was the real person that he was. He doesn't know himself. And it's the same is true of societies. Anthropologists talk about this all the time, that they're constantly discovering rules the society operates according to that the society has no idea. Not only has no idea, but might be horrified and insulted if you told them, by the way, did you know you work according to this rule? And it's true for a lot of people. If you tell them, by the way, based on your behavior, did you know this is your value system? Those are fighting words. A lot of people are like, it's okay if I'm racist as long as I don't believe I'm racist. And it's even if it causes untold misery for countless other people, as long as I'm convinced that I'm not racist and my friends don't call me racist, then it's fine. But if you call me racist, that's worse than a Holocaust because it affected me. I cannot, you have a moral obligation to cooperate with me in maintaining this fiction about who I believe myself to be. And to break that agreement by exposing who I actually am, telling the truth. If you do that, that's the worst possible crime you could commit. Certainly worse by far than the actual consequences of my actions, no matter how bad they are. You see this all the time in the modern world. And you see it even in people who you would think might be a doulos, and yet there is this intense Banausic artifice in the construction of their identity. And it's because, the nature of the society that we live in, the nature of modernity is Banausic. So even the douloi are heavily Banausified douloi. They exist in this network of obligations and rules and processes and categories and so on. It's fascinating. It's fascinating. What you described, is an example of an encounter with that, where a rule becomes exposed that nobody wanted to admit to or talk about. So this really, what you talked about really does go to the core of what he's talking about here, is this issue of why are some people incompetent to govern society is related in part to why some people are incompetent to govern themselves. Why none of us is perfectly competent to govern ourselves. We're Homo sapiens. We're not one of these other species. We're not a sunflower that naturally turns to follow the sun, right? I mean, we don't know where the sun is. we naturally turn to follow our enthusiasms, mistaking them for the sun, and being insulted if somebody tells us, by the way, that Pokemon card collection, that's not the sun. We're like, how dare you? Who are you to tell me that my desire is not the perfect embodiment of fulfillment for Homo sapiens? You must be mad, man. A duel. I demand a duel. It's a very strange. When you look at modernity through these other lenses, and right now we've only really looked at the ancient lens. We're getting the ability to look through the ancient lens. Moderns look weird. And and not in the ways that we wish. We always say, yeah, they would think we were gods. We can fly through the sky. We walked on them. They would worship us. It's like, no, they'd look at us like, is there an adult among you anywhere? What is wrong with you? Why are you all driven by your appetites and ideologies? You're so weird. So surely there's an adult. Please take me to your leader. Like, no, man, I'm completely free. I don't need any leaders. I'm in charge of my destiny. There's just the things with every sentence that comes out of our mouth, like Kenneth Smith says, unbeknownst to us, every sentence we say is a signature of our character. We're constantly revealing ourselves. And the only reason that we don't see it is that those uncomfortable truths fall into our blind spots, which is why we can't fix them in ourselves. So those things don't exist for us. So we can't see the signature. It's invisible to us. Camille, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I am a doula, a death doula. And the difference between back then, a doula is a servant of a person, really. But these days we get paid because we have to feed our families and whatnot.
Yeah.
To be like a doula in that way. And there's birth doulas now. So I don't know if it's coming back. This has only been really over the past 15 years that nurses are now becoming doulas, or people who want to have that gift hire themselves out as a doula. So that's very interesting.
It's a noble profession. I mean, I'm really impressed by the people who do the work you do.
Thank you. But you have to feed someone anyway. Don't care what other people think. I mean, it is an observation how society is. I just wanted to say, that I guess it was Phil. Don't let that bother you from helping people, because people are really changing in this world now. I don't know if it was the pandemic or what, but, just keep up the good work. That was really nice of you. Oh, that's nice, Ari. And a nurse. That's really nice. Yeah. So I am retired now, but, I had a lot of that with death, so.
Yeah.
And that's just helping people go into the next life. That's a different kind of birth.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Transition.
Yeah.
This
is very interesting, this class. I mean, it's a lot I have to study, but I need my brain to start working better. So I'm enjoying it,
I'm glad.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm glad. Yeah, thank you, Camille. That term doula that's used for both of these kinds of professions, the birth doula and the death doula, it is derived from the same original Greek root. But of course, the word that we're using, doula, means something radically different than the way that the Greeks used the term douloi in the way that Kenneth Smith's talking about here. So, a doula is the use of that term is picking up, like you said, that connotation of being a servant, and serving one another and helping one another in a noble way. Whereas, in the Greek class society, douloi was being used in a condemnatory way, not to describe people who did the professions that we're talking about here, but to describe people who are ruled by their appetites and their parochial experiences. So I wouldn't want to mix up the two and have you think that that Kenneth Smith is in any way critiquing birth doula or death doula as being the same thing. They're totally different, despite the relationship between the words. But it's very good to hear. My profession has been very close to medicine. I've been doing medical informatics for 40 years. this month. And you know, I have intense respect for the people who take on the challenges that you take on.
Yeah, that's great. We have a lot of respect for informatics people.
Because the medicine's gotten so complicated, right? How do they
Yeah,
yeah, you get these people who are on, you know, 14 medications, and if we don't, we need computers just to keep
yeah,
track of the interactions. You know?
right.
So, yeah. Anyway, thanks, Camille.
Uh-huh.
Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yes, it's say something about the this Russian situation. 40 years ago, I'd spend all my time playing, you know, board games based on the Russian campaign and stuff like that, and it aroused my curiosity enormously. And must have been 30 years ago, I was thinking, well, is there a method to conquer Russia? You know, Napoleon tried it, Hitler tried it. They were both disadvantaged by a Britain that was cutting them off in terms of sea trade. And I wondered, is there going to be somebody that's going to have a third go? And I thought, well, the Americans are the only power that could. And I thought, that's just crazy. I can't see that happening. It would take a long time. And I thought, well, maybe things will come to a head around the year 2050 and I'll be dead and gone and I won't have to worry about anything. But within my lifetime, when I'm still ready to jump into a sports car and chase young maidens, I'm only 64, still young. It's happening. I thought 30 years ago, well, what would be an alternate method? Now, Hitler and Napoleon couldn't take too much time because Britain was cutting off the world supply. But this time, since it's the Anglos that are invading, they can take their time, and the thing would be, let's grab away what they control, like particularly the Ukraine. If we can get that away from them, we can use Ukraine as a tool to conquer Russia. And, you know, when I hear people talking about, they're saying, oh, well, do you think we can break up Russia? These are people that call themselves good. It wouldn't be convenient just to destroy an entire civilization. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, no, Matali introduced me to Spengler, and I was quite surprised that I was copying a lot of Spengler's basic methods in how he did things, in how he was able to predict things. I didn't realise, but maybe I'd filtered in some Spengler from somewhere and picked up on his method without even reading Spengler. But his warning was this: the Russians are a different culture. Your rules, no matter how well-meaning you think they are, do not apply. You go to Vietnam. Surely we can find inside the Vietnamese Americans that are just screaming to get out. I think Montgomery warned the Americans about this, that these Oriental cultures don't think that they're your inferior. As far as they're concerned, their culture is very old and very sophisticated, and they're just as good as you, if not better. That's their attitude. They're not overawed by the West as much as you think. It's the same in Iraq, you know, Bush Jr. We'll have them all eating ice cream in no time. Well, I do see one big beneficiary out of the 2003 war, some American oil companies that are still making big profits. Well, that's my warning. Putin might be a thug. His oligarchs might be thugs. Not that they aren't without their own reflections in the West. in certain subtle way. We are ruled by oligarchs as well. We just care not to notice. Russia is different. Your recipe, your homeopathic remedy for Russia, your very best that works for you is not going to work for them. And this is where this idea of peeling Ukraine away. We'll use a slow method of getting to Moscow. We'll pull everything apart and we'll pull the carpet from under them. I'm very suspicious that this strategy is not going to work because they're going to strike problems that you don't get when you go straight for Russia, which entails its own problems. So I think Russia has a right to defend its existence because the other guys are virtually saying we're going to tear that country apart when we can get there. This is what I'm seeing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. We're gonna set that aside for now. I know there's a temptation to want to have these calls be primarily about what's going on in the Ukraine and Russia, and I understand that temptation. It's what's going on in the news, and it's a huge deal, and it's scary. But I don't think we'll get to the bottom of it here. Certainly, if we do get to the bottom of it here, it'll come at the cost of making progress on these other issues that we're trying to talk about. But thank you for certainly bringing up the word of caution about how we interpret our understanding of what's happening and how we got there. The only part that I'll add is there's certainly a lot more going on in the conflict between the West and Russia than just an invasion of Ukraine. This has been a long time coming, and it's about a lot more than what happened there. But setting that aside, let's go back to the text. There's another thing to unpack from this sentence, and that's from the end of the sentence when he says that the Duloy don't fully grasp what prerequisites of free citizenry and philosophical individuality they lack by nature. And the issue that he's talking about here are the issues of freedom and individuality. What does it mean to be free? And what does it mean to be a person? And I'm going to take the second one first. This is all Kenneth Smith stuff. He's written about it elsewhere. And we know his main influences. We know how he draws from Heraclitus and Aristotle. He draws from, Hegel and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Arendt and others. So when we put all those things together, we see that these key loaded terms, free and individuality, well, by nature as well. But it was fun having you, Camille. We'll see you next time. These key terms, freedom and individuality, are incredibly loaded here. And one of the ways that they're loaded is that they connect to Heraclitus's ethos anthropoi daimon, which is traditionally translated as character as fate. And both of them come out of the same issue, which is by nature, and by here we mean ethos, the inner nature of both of Homo sapiens and of any one of us. Our thoughts and behavior are constrained by our character. It's not the only constraint, right? Life is not merely exercising our will and getting what we want. It's also, as Joe said, last week, it's agency and contingency. So both are factored in. What's going on around us is a major factor in what happens, and what it is that we are driven by our character to try to do, what we're driven by our character to notice, to care about, to feel, or to think about and try to act on, that's driven by our character. Different people with different characters will look at the same situation and do different things. Kenneth Smith has piles of quotes from various writers and philosophers that he liberally sprinkles across his works that are on this very subject right here. A classic that he does is the William Blake letter to Reverend Tressler, where the Reverend decided not to pay William Blake the money that he promised for a big painting of a tree that William Blake did. And he did it because he said, well, the tree didn't look right. It wasn't what he wanted to see. And William Blake came back with this famous letter that has the quote, "As a man is, so he sees. That's one of Kenneth Smith's favorite quotes. As a man is, so he sees. He says, what a banker sees when he looks at a tree is completely different from what an artist or someone who loves nature for its own sake sees when they look at a tree. And as a result, what it means is that we're looking at the same world, but what we end up with different pictures of that world in our heads, which is, it drives a stake into the heart of the idea that we are born with any kind of objectivity. It says we're all seeing different things when we look at the same thing. And what we see affects us differently. We care about it in different ways. It motivates us to act in different ways. And those differences aren't just random. It's not just we're all pretty snowflakes and we're all special. It's each of us, according to our nature, interprets the world and feels the things we feel. Yeah, what Gordon Gekko sees in a company, totally different from what somebody else might see in a company. That's an excellent example. So the by nature that ends that sentence is a reference to Aristotle, who relentlessly says, man by nature desires to know. Man by nature is a political animal. By nature, kata phusei, which takes us back to section A of chapter 4, which was the first of the major features of the ancient worldview that Kenneth wanted us to get to know. That to the ancients, nature's not just this big empty place that happens to have some stuff in it for us to steal from each other, but rather that the world is a process of becoming and unfolding in which new order is arising from the existing order in such a way that everything is not just what it is, but it's also the seed of what it's going to become in the future. There's this constant process of unfolding new order that's going on. And the Greek word phusis for nature means literally becoming. That is their word. They don't say nature, they say becoming. The world of becoming. It's the universe is the place where things become. So, that was part of what Section A was about. But the other half of what Section A was about is nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. That the way you settle arguments is not by punching each other, or do I like your arguments, or do the rules say that your argument is valid? The way you settle arguments is, well, what does nature have to say about it? That nature is the ultimate authority and source of meaning. And so the way that you express that is with the phrase kata, meaning according to, and phusei, meaning phusis, nature, according to the nature of things. And when Aristotle is saying man by nature desires to know, what most moderns do is they just cross out the by nature part as just flavor language. And they say, oh, man desires to know. And that's not what Aristotle's saying at all. They're saying it is the nature, it is the character of Homo sapiens that we have this craving to know things. It's not something we get a choice about. It's written into our character as a species. It's one of the things that it's part of our arete. It's part of our excellence that allows our species to survive, that we're so relentlessly curious. It's key to our survival. And what it means is that people who don't want to know things, whose minds have turned off, are falling short of the gifts that Homo sapiens has that allow us to survive. They're dying in their minds as their curiosity ebbs. They're being less human. They're losing their humanness through their lack of desire to know. And we know that he means that because he really has a go at that in his one about man by nature as a political animal, where he basically says somebody who's not political isn't human. He says it right out. He says they're either bestial, like, a bear that can live by itself in the woods, or they'd have to be a god, because gods don't need other people. But if they're neither a god nor a beast, then they're political. We don't get to solve our problems in the world by ourselves according to our personal preferences. We have to negotiate. And part of why we have to negotiate is that we want different things. But part of the reason we have to negotiate is that many of the things we want can only be resolved if a whole bunch of us work together to solve the problem. Man by himself is a semi-futile thing. It's like we have this complicated relationship between the individual and the group, and that's core. That's part of our arete as Homo sapiens. It's core to our identity by nature. So when he says at the end of this sentence that douloi ... by nature, he's saying it is the character of people who are douloi. It is written into the structure of their soul that they're going to miss these things. It's not a happenstance. And you can't just tell them the part that they're missing because the character's not receptive to that part. It's like that Far Side cartoon. They just hear you saying blah, 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 ginger, blah, blah, blah. The only part they pick out is the part that their character is willing to hear, and the rest of it just turns into noise and fades into the background. You can't get them to notice the thing that by nature their character will not let them absorb or see, because it repels those things like water off a duck's back. So that's one of the critical parts of this sentence. Kenneth Smith never uses the phrase by nature casually or as flavor language. He's way too steeped in Aristotle. When he says by nature, you should always translate it to katafuse. That's always what he means. He means we're talking about issues of character here. We're talking about the structure of their identity. And that's what takes us to freedom and individuality. I'll finish up in time for Phil to get to I'll make sure that you get your what it is that you want to say, in before today ends. I know we're coming up on the end, but this freedom and individuality thing, this flows right out of that. So ethos anthropoi daimon, Heraclitus, right? The fragment, ethos anthropoi daimon. Ethos is character, right? So, and anthropoi is man or people or any group of people. It's an ambiguous term that can refer to multiple levels of organization within Homo sapiens, from the entire species all the way down to the individual, certainly including a family or a neighborhood or a polis or a people like the Hellenes. All of those would fall under anthropoi. So this is a statement about multiple different levels of organization of people at the same time, saying it applies to all of them. And daimon is saying that your ethos rules over you like a god. It has so much authority over what you see and don't see, what you care about and don't care about, what you do and don't do, what you think and don't think. It's so overpowering in its influence over you that it might as well be Zeus. It's like a god. It's not something that you can ignore or brush off. It's like, and I speak coming from an alcoholic family, it's like the bottle is to someone who's born with the alcoholic gene. You're stuck if you've got the alcoholic gene, you're trapped in active alcoholism if you think you can negotiate with the bottle. You think you can test yourself and prove that it doesn't rule you. The only way out of the trap of the bottle for people like me, my wife doesn't have this problem, she doesn't have the gene. But for someone like me, the only way out of the bottle is either not to get into it in the first place, which is the route I chose, or if you're in, you have to acknowledge that you don't have power over it. It has power over you. And the only way out is to acknowledge it right up front and to stop testing yourself, stop tempting yourself, stop trying to prove that it doesn't have power over you, because it does. So ethos anthropoi daimon is saying you need to stop pretending that your character doesn't rule you. Because as long as you pretend that it's just a detail that you can ignore, you're going to be its slave. You're going to be slave to your character. Your only chance is to take it seriously. And of course, what the Greeks say is, if your circumstances are right and your character is right, you can learn to study your own character, map out the terrain of who you are, and then start cultivating your character to change it slowly over time through the development of better habits. But that takes a willingness to acknowledge its authority over you. Only then do you get authority over it in a gradual, slow, careful, caretaking kind of way. And what Heraclitus is saying is not unique to Heraclitus. All the Greeks believe this. I mean, there's evidence of that. Once you grok it, you see evidence of it all over the writings of Aristotle, Plato, Thales. It's everywhere. Everybody's always taking it for granted among the Greeks. That's why, but few of them just come out and say it boldly the way where Heraclitus does. So what they think is, therefore, our relationship to our character is complicated in the following way. If we don't study our character, if we don't know ourselves, Genothi Seauton, right, says the Oracle of Delphi, if we don't know ourselves and we don't take responsibility for our character and begin the process of cultivation to improve the worst parts of it, then we have no appreciable freedom. Then character is fate in the way that the English translation means, because all we are is acting out. We're symptoms of our character rather than people. There's a book I can't remember the name of the author, called It Could Never Happen to Me, that's about alcoholism. It was formative in my life. I read it in the late 80s. And one of the things that she says in there is the way that families that suffer from alcoholism all look like each other. There's a limited number of strategies that people can adopt to deal with the bottle. And if the father is an alcoholic, what happens to the mother and the children? There's only a handful of possible strategies, and it results in stereotypical roles so that all the alcoholic families, and there's always going to be an enabler, there's always going to be a mediator, there's always going to be a dramatist who acts out and is the problem child to distract attention away from the alcoholism. These roles crop up in every alcoholic family. And the reason is, if you live an unexamined life of the type Socrates is warning you about, then your life you become a symptom of the thing that rules you, rather than a genuine individual of your own. I was the mediator. I was the loquacious one who tried to solve problems by getting people to talk together and understand each other and calming down tensions. And in so doing, I was perpetuating the alcoholism, right? All the problems the alcoholism caused, I was papering them over by helping everyone calm down and get better. It's like a child's version of the enabler, which is usually the other parent. My younger brother, who's homeless, he was the dramatizer. He would act out and get in trouble. And it seemed like the wrong thing to do, because he was always in trouble, and nothing's worse than trouble to a modern. But on the other hand, he was the one that drew attention to the fact that the family had a problem. He was actually doing more to break us free of the alcoholism than I was. Both of us were stereotypes. We were both basically unfree symptoms of our character.
Did he also deny help from the family members? I mean, when he was homeless, did he deny help from his family members when he was homeless?
He let me help.
Oh, he did help. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, we love each other. So this is what he's talking about freedom. When he says the prerequisites of free citizenry, he's saying people who don't accept that they've got this problem where their character is like a god over them, and whatever its structure is going to determine their choices unless and until they take responsibility. The modern version of saying this is own your own bullshit. Unless you're willing to own your own bullshit and say, yeah, this is my character and it does cause these problems in my behavior. Unless and until you do that, you're not a free person. You're just a collection of symptoms of whatever your character happens to be. And as such, you have no genuine individuality. Like I didn't have any genuine individuality. I mean, I had a personality and people could recognize me on the street. They know my tone of voice and what were my hobbies and my likes and dislikes. But none of that changed the fact that I kept acting like a mediator in an alcoholic family. And I did so even when it was completely inappropriate. And even when it, made things hard for my friends and family or myself. I couldn't stop doing it because it was my character, until the point when I acknowledged that my character was like a god over me and I needed to take responsibility for it. So it's why this stuff that Kenneth is talking about is easier for me than it is for a lot of people to accept, because I'd already gone through this just around the bottle. So the idea of generalizing those lessons to, no, it's not just alcoholism, it's my entire character. That's the god over me. The alcoholism is just one of the features of that character. I just happen to be born with that piece, even though I've never practiced. But the rest of it is there too, all the other parts of my character, and they rule me too, unless and until I take responsibility and start cultivating it. So this is what he means. This sentence isn't designed to say, yeah, we should pick on those douloi because we can. They can't stop us. So we're smarter than they are. We can outwit them, and that'll allow us to run society and make them our draft animals. None of that is the intent of this sentence, nor is it the intent of the ancient Greek perspective. The ancient Greek perspective is, this is how people already are. It's just how we find them according to nature in the world. And some people are willing to come to grips with this problem and others are not. And the ones who are not, what can you do with them? It's like trying to get someone to stop drinking when they deny that they're an alcoholic. You can't force them to stop drinking. They're stuck. So douloi are people who are stuck at a certain stage in human development because they're not willing to hear that they're responsible for their own behavior and feelings. It's why they say, you made me angry. They're saying it's your fault. Everything that I did when I was angry, that's not my responsibility. That's your fault. You made me that way. That's the classic, don't knock out calls and listen, try it. So that's the classic expression of the dualic ethos in a nutshell, which is no way can you make me take responsibility for what I do when I'm angry. It's your fault, not my fault. Just don't make me angry and everything will be fine. And if you watch the Hulk TV show in the 1970s, what did Bill Bixby always say? Little weedy Bill Bixby, when people were coming to rough him up, don't make me angry. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry, right? Because he's going to turn into the Hulk. And that's the dualic ethos, again, in a nutshell. I can't be held responsible for what I do when I act according to my character. So it must be your fault, not my fault. Phil, come off mute and tell me what's on your mind. Oh, you got to unmute there. You're still on mute.
Yeah, I'm unmuted now. I'm glad you started out with William Blake, because my lecture on modern art begins, of course, in the 19th century. And the first three people I mentioned was first William Blake's painting in 1795 of Newton drawing the compass that inscribed the movement of the heavens. So it's an interesting painting because it was both a kind of praise of Newton for being able to trace out the mind of God in some sense, intellectually. But it's also a criticism because by being so embedded in that, he is ignoring the beauty that surrounds him in a much more complex way. So that was sort of one directional. So he sort of said both things, because that was the beginning in a way that the arts, like I said, was always comfortable relationship with philosophy. But I think that the introduction of the hard sciences created a division. And that was a reaction against modern science to a certain degree, by saying, don't forget about being in the world, nature. The second picture I have was Beethoven, which I love very much. And I want to bring that picture up so I could read the quote. Beethoven said, music is the one incorporeal entrance into the higher world of knowledge, which comprehends mankind, but which mankind cannot comprehend. So the fact that it talks about the limitations of human being, that we are comprehended by nature, but we can't really comprehend it. And music at least gives us an incorporeal entrance into this higher world of knowledge. So that's very, very interesting. In other words, he's talking about harmony of some sort, that we, in a sense, are related to nature, by our human nature. That's a pathway. And it really reminded me a little bit of the Tao. So, and then the third picture was a painting by Victor Hugo. Now, everybody knows that Victor Hugo is a writer and a poet, but very few understand that he was also a very great artist, not well known. And he painted a picture that I thought, although I wouldn't call it the greatest painting of the 19th century, it was the paradigm expression of the poetic moment within 19th century imagination. This hand reaching to the infinite, sort of evaporating the clouds. But it hasn't reached the end, hasn't objectified, but is reaching in this activity of becoming an unfolding of the human spirit within nature. I think that really captures the 19th century as well as in any painting. And my thought is that, you know, like, I think I like that in a sense it incorporates that, because what it does says is that the problem with, to a certain degree, philosophy, and certainly to a greater degree, the hard sciences, is it tends to over objectify things into a reification. And I think what that did, in a funny way, I didn't know they didn't have these words at that time. Through the history of human beings in relationship to society, we created what I call eco-2, the second ecology. We did not know, I don't think even the Greeks knew, that there was something called ecology. In other words, individual beings structured in a symphony of other beings in relationship to each other. And we are not only beginning to understand that, and I think in some sense, I don't want to overstress this, because I certainly believe in objectification to a certain degree, but not to the degree of reification that is more real than the reality, is that I wonder whether that is not the burden of civilization itself, in Freud's understanding of civilization and discontent. So it almost seems that we constructed this ecosystem that in a sense force us, like I said in the last expression I had about being in the hamburger place, and there's an ecology that tells me, no, you're violating the rules of the ecology. Not that everybody comprehends that, but I think this burden, in a sense, started in the transition to be the Paleolithic and Neolithic world. Civilization requires us to create the structure of relationships. And to a certain degree, there's a burden, and we have to figure out how to live within that structure that we all have to obey, but on the other hand, we also free from it to a certain degree. And how do we negotiate that relationship? And it seems to me, since we developed the concept of ecology, that I see Hegel in a completely different way, you know, because he's actually talking about the ecology, but I think he focused a little bit too much on the structure of the ecology rather than the fact, although he actually puts it in a dynamic way, the movement toward, right? But you could sort of see that he's also objectifying it, because there's an end to the destiny at which I think that's not true. The movement toward the thing that we will never know for sure, but we harmonize with it. I think that's the funny context we made, that we made a second ecology, and we have trouble, in a sense, understanding the first ecology, which in a sense allows us to live within that ecological cycle rather than eco-2. And now we can't get out of eco-2 to even think about eco-1. And so in some sense, I think, no, I don't want to say, oh, I want to go back to the Paleolithic. I'm not saying that at all. I'm wondering whether we could figure out some way to, in a sense, remain on the one hand nomadic and yet live within a structure of eco-2. You know what I mean? It's like sort of, it reminds me of the walkabout. I was asking somebody who was teaching, actually, it was Aristotle in some sense. And he happened to be mentioning Kant, and he said, But the problem with, Aristotle is that he didn't get deeper because it's in sort of the first impression of how nature works, you have to think deeper in the sense of representation and understand the human structure that imposes on that. And I asked him a question. I said, is it possible that you could have a somewhat of an intuitive understanding of that, even though you haven't read Kant? And I told him an example of when I was teaching an art class, either the first, I think it's the second class I taught. I was, of course, a modernist, and I believe in movement, in a dynamic system. And that's quite confusing to a lot of students. At the end, this one student asked me, she was an older woman, well, not older than I am now, but certainly older to me. And she thought, okay, my radical move was just sort of avant-garde in some sense. She didn't understand the other thing, which is the structure of the framing of the whole in relationship to art itself. She asked a question, says, have you ever read, I'm okay, you're okay? And my immediate answer was, and I knew that she was not asking an aesthetic question. She sort of felt that I had that attitude that maybe, yeah, let everybody be what they are. And I immediately said, I'm okay, you're not okay. I actually said it in a much more colorful language. And I told this guy who was conducting this seminar and mentioned Kant and that deeper penetration of understanding of the, of the categories and all that kind of stuff. I said I had not studied Kant at that time, or Hegel. How did I know that the aspirations, the movement of a singularity that want to move within the structure also existed within the structure itself as well, which is like, and I knew it, I suppose, intuitively through art, because I knew that when you have a frame of reference, the frame of reference actually framed the thing, You could say, well, let's say you play basketball and you step on the line to make the 3 points, and they ruled that out. It said, oh, that's not fair. I actually made a better shot outside of the boundary. The problem is that you wouldn't have the game of basketball if you didn't have the rules. Yes, that's a great shot, but unfortunately, it's outside the structure of the human composition of what the thing is. So all rules, in some sense, impose a structure within you, and in some sense, it creates a larger structure in which you also have to play the rules as well as play the breaking of the rules. Okay, and I think that duality that exists in Kant is like, I didn't study Kant, but I seem to know that, at least intuitively, to understanding art. I said, is that possible? And he gave a very convoluted answer that sort of suggested not really. And I said, well, how in the hell did I know how to give that answer? Instead of saying, you're right, you're okay, I'm okay. Everything is good, everything's cool, we could do whatever we want. I realized that wasn't the case. I realized she was asking a social political question rather than an aesthetic question. So I'll just leave it at that. It seems to me you might you might be able to get an understanding of something intuitively, at least to a certain degree, without actually knowing the philosophical argument as well. I think the philosophy helps to shore that up, but I think, I go along with Beethoven, yeah, you have a gateway to understanding, to approach the thing that you'll never understand, but that understands you. I think in some sense, that leaves it actually much more open than said, oh, I got it exactly, I know what the destiny is. And we don't. So we leave that kind of open. And I think that's what the arts does that allows that to happen. That's it. That's all I got to say, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. And on that, we'll wrap up for this week. Thanks, everybody. I had a great time, and I hope you did too. And we'll next week we'll wrap up paragraph 2 and start into paragraph 3. So
thanks so much. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you, Ari. It's a pleasure having you here. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Rick.
Thank you, Ray.